What is a democracy, really? At first glance, the idea of democracy appears simple, almost self-explanatory. It is often described as rule by the people, a system in which citizens choose their leaders through free and fair elections. This definition is repeated in textbooks, speeches, and political campaigns around the world. It sounds reassuring, it sounds stable, it sounds permanent. But democracy, in reality, is far more fragile and far more complex than that simple phrase suggests. To understand how democracies collapse, we must first understand what they truly are. Not in theory, not in slogans, but in practice. Democracy is not just a system of elections. It is a delicate ecosystem of institutions, norms, behaviors, and shared beliefs. Elections are only the visible surface. Beneath them lies a structure that must be constantly maintained, protected, and respected by both leaders and citizens alike. At its core, democracy depends on several essential pillars. The first is free and fair elections. Citizens must have the genuine ability to choose their leaders without coercion, manipulation, or fear. This includes not only the act of voting itself, but also equal access to information, fair competition among candidates, and trust in the integrity of the process. If elections are manipulated even slightly, the entire foundation begins to crack. The second pillar is the rule of law. In a functioning democracy, no one is above the law, not even those in power. Laws must be applied consistently and fairly, and institutions such as courts must remain independent from political pressure. When leaders begin to treat laws as obstacles rather than boundaries, democracy begins to weaken. The third pillar is the system of checks and balances. Power must never be concentrated in one place. Governments are designed with separate branches, each capable of limiting the others. This structure exists to prevent the abuse of power. When one branch becomes dominant or when others fail to resist, the balance begins to tilt dangerously. The fourth pillar is freedom of expression and a free press. A democracy cannot function without the open exchange of ideas. Journalists must be able to investigate and criticize those in power. Citizens must be free to speak, protest, and disagree. Without these freedoms, truth becomes distorted and accountability disappears. Finally, there is something less tangible but equally important: public trust and shared norms. Democracy relies on an unwritten agreement among its participants. Leaders are expected to respect limits, even when they could bypass them. Citizens are expected to accept election results, even when they are disappointed. Opponents are treated not as enemies, but as rivals within a shared system. This invisible framework is what holds everything together, and yet it is also the most vulnerable part of democracy. Unlike laws, norms cannot be enforced by courts. Unlike institutions, trust cannot be rebuilt overnight. Once these elements begin to erode, the decline of democracy can accelerate rapidly and often silently. One of the most dangerous misconceptions about democracy is the belief that it is self-sustaining. Many assume that once established, democratic systems will naturally continue. History suggests otherwise. Democracies do not collapse only through violent revolutions or military coups. More often, they decay gradually, through small changes that seem insignificant at first. A law is adjusted here, a rule is bent there, a norm is ignored, a line is crossed, but only slightly. Individually, these actions may not appear alarming. They are often justified as necessary, temporary, or even beneficial. But over time, these small deviations accumulate. The system begins to shift. What was once unthinkable becomes acceptable. What was once unacceptable becomes normal. This is how democracies begin to fail, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow transformation. Another critical aspect of democracy is the role of the citizen. In theory, citizens are the ultimate source of power. They vote, they participate, they hold leaders accountable. But in practice, this responsibility is often underestimated. Democracy requires active engagement. It demands attention, awareness, and at times, resistance. When citizens become passive, when they disengage from politics, ignore warning signs, or prioritize comfort over vigilance, the system becomes vulnerable. Complacency is one of the greatest threats to democratic stability. Leaders also play a decisive role. In a healthy democracy, those in power exercise restraint. They respect not only the letter of the law, but its spirit. They understand that their authority is temporary and conditional. However, when leaders begin to see power as something to be held indefinitely, the nature of governance changes. The shift is often subtle at first. A leader may attack critics more aggressively. They may question the legitimacy of institutions. They may portray themselves as the sole representative of the people, dismissing all opposition as illegitimate. These are not isolated behaviors, they are signals, and they raise an important question. If democracy depends so heavily on behavior, norms, and trust, what happens when those elements begin to disappear? The answer is both simple and unsettling. Democracy does not collapse all at once. It unravels. It unravels when elections still occur, but no longer offer real choice. It unravels when laws still exist, but are applied selectively. It unravels when institutions remain, but no longer function independently. It unravels when citizens can speak, but no longer feel heard or safe. From the outside, the system may still appear intact. The forms remain. The language remains. Leaders continue to speak of democracy, even as its substance fades away. This is what makes democratic collapse so difficult to recognize in real time. It does not always look like a crisis. It often looks like normality until it is too late. Understanding democracy requires us to look beyond definitions and examine realities. It requires us to ask not just whether elections exist, but whether they are meaningful. Not just whether laws are written, but whether they are respected. Not just whether institutions stand, but whether they function as intended. Democracy is not a fixed state. It is a continuous process, one that must be actively sustained. And as history has shown, it can just as easily be undone. Chapter 2. The Myth of Permanent Freedom. Freedom once achieved feels permanent. That belief has shaped the thinking of generations. People grow up within democratic systems and assume that the rights they enjoy, freedom of speech, fair elections, legal protection, are natural features of society, almost like air or gravity. They are rarely seen as fragile. They are rarely seen as temporary. But history tells a very different story. Freedom is not a permanent condition. It is a moment in time, sustained only by continuous effort. Every democracy that has existed has faced periods of strain, decline, or collapse. Some have recovered, many have not. The assumption that freedom, once gained, cannot be lost is not only incorrect, it is dangerous. The idea of permanent freedom is comforting because it removes responsibility. If freedom is guaranteed, then there is no urgent need to protect it. There is no need for vigilance, no need for sacrifice, no need for concern. Citizens can focus on their private lives, confident that the system will continue to function without their active participation. This is where the problem begins. Democratic systems depend not only on laws and institutions, but on the awareness and engagement of the people who live within them. When citizens begin to take their freedoms for granted, they become less likely to notice when those freedoms are being weakened. Small changes go unchallenged. Subtle shifts in power pass without resistance. Over time, what was once protected becomes vulnerable. One of the reasons the myth of permanent freedom is so persistent is that democratic decline is rarely immediate. Freedoms are not usually removed overnight. Instead, they are gradually limited, redefined, or selectively applied. A right may still exist in law, but its practical meaning begins to shrink. Freedom of speech, for example, may remain officially protected, yet certain voices are increasingly marginalized or discouraged. Elections may continue to be held, but the conditions under which they take place become less fair. Legal systems may still operate, but their independence begins to erode. Because these changes are incremental, they are easy to overlook. People adapt. They adjust their expectations. What would have been unacceptable in the past becomes tolerable in the present. The boundaries of freedom shift quietly, without a clear moment of rupture. Another factor that reinforces the illusion of permanence is generational distance. Those who have experienced the loss of freedom firsthand tend to recognize its fragility. They understand how quickly conditions can change. But as time passes, those experiences fade from collective memory. New generations grow up without direct knowledge of repression or our instability. For them, democracy is not an achievement, it is a given. Without a sense of historical perspective, it becomes difficult to imagine that the system could fail. This loss of memory weakens the instinct to protect. At the same time, modern democracies often appear highly stable. They have established institutions, written constitutions, and long traditions of governance. These features create an image of strength and durability. They suggest that the system is deeply rooted and resistant to disruption. Yet, stability can be misleading. What appears strong on the surface may, in reality, depend on conditions that are constantly shifting. Economic pressures, political polarization, social unrest, and external threats can all place strain on democratic systems. When these pressures intensify, the resilience of the system is tested. If the underlying norms and values are weak, the system can begin to fracture. It is also important to recognize that freedom is not evenly experienced by all members of society. In many democracies, certain groups have historically faced limitations on their rights, even while others enjoyed broad protections. This uneven distribution can create a false sense of security among those who are less affected. When restrictions begin to expand, they are often introduced gradually, targeting specific groups before affecting the wider population. By the time the impact becomes universal, the mechanisms of control are already well established. The belief in permanent freedom discourages early action. It leads people to dismiss warning signs, to assume that existing protections will hold, and to underestimate the speed at which conditions can change. It fosters complacency at precisely the moment when awareness is most needed. To understand democracy, one must abandon the idea of permanence. Freedom is not a finished achievement. It is an ongoing process shaped by decisions, actions, and attitudes. It requires constant attention, not because collapse is inevitable, but because it is always possible. The history of democratic societies does not support the notion of guaranteed stability. Instead, it reveals a pattern of rise, strain, and in many cases, decline. The systems that endure are those that are actively maintained, not those that are passively assumed to be secure. Recognizing the fragility of freedom is not a cause for pessimism. It is a call for awareness. Only by understanding that freedom can be lost can it be effectively protected. Chapter 3. Why Democracies Feel Safe. Democracies are designed to feel safe. They offer structure, predictability, and a sense of order. Elections occur at regular intervals. Laws are written and publicly accessible. Institutions operate according to established procedures. For most citizens, daily life unfolds without direct interference from the state. This creates an environment that feels stable and secure. Over time, this feeling becomes deeply ingrained. People come to trust the system not only because it functions, but because it has always functioned within their experience. Stability becomes the norm. Disruption becomes difficult to imagine. The absence of visible crisis reinforces the belief that the system is fundamentally sound. This perception of safety is one of democracy's greatest strengths and one of its greatest vulnerabilities. The sense of security in democratic societies is not accidental. It is the result of carefully constructed institutions and long-standing practices. These include the peaceful transfer of power, the independence of the judiciary, the protection of civil liberties, and the existence of a free press. Together, these elements create a framework that reduces uncertainty and limits the potential for sudden upheaval. However, the very effectiveness of this framework can lead to overconfidence. When systems work reliably over long periods, people begin to assume that they will continue to do so indefinitely. The possibility of failure is pushed to the margins of thought. Concerns about instability are often dismissed as exaggerated or unrealistic. This is particularly true in established democracies with long histories. The longer a system has endured, the more it is perceived as permanent. Its survival becomes evidence of its strength, rather than a reminder of the need for continued vigilance. Another reason democracies feel safe is that their processes are often gradual and procedural. Change does not typically occur through sudden dramatic events. Instead, it unfolds through legislation, elections, and institutional decisions. These processes create a sense of continuity, even when significant shifts are taking place. Because changes are embedded within familiar procedures, they appear less threatening. A law that limits certain rights may be passed through a legitimate legislative process. A leader who concentrates power may do so within the boundaries of existing rules. An institution may lose its independence without being formally dismantled. In each case, the appearance of normality is preserved. This makes it difficult to recognize when the system is moving in a dangerous direction. The role of trust is also central. Democracies rely heavily on trust. Trust in institutions, trust in leaders, and trust in fellow citizens. This trust allows the system to function smoothly, reducing the need for constant scrutiny or enforcement. But trust can also create blind spots. When people trust that institutions will act appropriately, they are less likely to question decisions or investigate changes. When they trust that leaders will respect limits, they are less likely to challenge expansions of power. When they trust that other citizens share their commitment to democratic values, they are less likely to prepare for conflict. This environment of trust, while essential, can delay recognition of emerging threats. Media and public discourse further reinforce the sense of safety. In stable periods, political issues are often framed as manageable disagreements rather than existential risks. Debates focus on policy differences, economic priorities, or social issues rather than the stability of the system itself. As a result, structural changes may receive less attention than they deserve. Even when warning signs appear, they are often interpreted within the context of normal political competition. Actions that weaken democratic norms may be seen as strategic moves rather than systemic threats. This interpretation reduces the perceived urgency of the situation. Comfort also plays a role. In societies where basic needs are met and daily life is relatively predictable, there is little incentive to question the broader system. Stability encourages routine. Routine reduces awareness. Over time, attention shifts away from the mechanisms that sustain democracy. The system continues to function, but fewer people are actively engaged in its maintenance. This combination of trust, routine, and gradual change creates a powerful illusion of safety. It suggests that the system is self-correcting, capable of addressing any problems that arise. It implies that serious threats will be obvious and unmistakable. In reality, the most significant threats to democracy are often subtle. They emerge within the system, not outside it. They develop through legal processes, not in defiance of them. They advance step by step, not all at once. Because democracies feel safe, these threats can grow without immediate resistance. Understanding this dynamic is essential. The sense of security provided by democratic systems should not be mistaken for immunity. Stability is not the same as invulnerability. A system can appear strong while its foundations are being weakened. Recognizing the limits of perceived safety is the first step toward preserving what that safety represents. Chapter 4. Early Warning Signs. Nobody notices the collapse of a democracy is rarely a sudden event. It does not usually begin with a clear declaration or an unmistakable turning point. Instead, it starts with small, often ambiguous changes, subtle shifts that are easy to overlook or dismiss. These early warning signs are not hidden, but they are rarely recognized for what they are. This is not because they are invisible, but because they do not appear dangerous at first. One of the earliest signs is a change in political language. Public discourse begins to shift in tone and content. Opponents are no longer described as rivals with different ideas, but as threats to the nation. Disagreement becomes framed as disloyalty. Criticism is labeled as sabotage. This change in language may seem rhetorical, even superficial, but it reflects a deeper transformation in how political competition is understood. When opponents are treated as enemies, the boundaries of acceptable behavior begin to expand. Another early sign is the gradual erosion of respect for institutions. Leaders may begin to question the legitimacy of courts, electoral bodies, or the media. At first, these criticisms may be presented as isolated concerns or necessary reforms. Over time, they become more frequent and more aggressive. The goal is not always to dismantle institutions immediately, but to weaken public confidence in them. As trust declines, it becomes easier to justify changes that limit independence or increase control. Legal boundaries may also begin to shift. Actions that would once have been considered unacceptable are reinterpreted or justified within existing frameworks. Laws may be adjusted to accommodate new practices. Procedures may be altered in ways that benefit those in power. Each change may appear minor. Each may be defended as reasonable. But together they create a pattern. This pattern often goes unnoticed because it lacks a clear point of crisis. The role of the media is another critical area. Early signs include increased hostility toward journalists, attempts to discredit reporting, and the spread of conflicting narratives. Information becomes more fragmented. Facts are contested. The distinction between truth and opinion begins to blur. In this environment, it becomes more difficult for citizens to form a clear understanding of events. Confusion replaces clarity. Uncertainty replaces confidence. Public reaction to these developments is often muted. Because the changes are gradual, they do not generate immediate alarm. People may disagree about their significance or assume that they are temporary. Others may not notice them at all. This lack of response allows the process to continue. Polarization within society can also serve as an early warning sign. As divisions deepen, compromise becomes more difficult. Political identity becomes more rigid. People begin to view those with opposing views not just as wrong, but as fundamentally different. This environment makes it easier for leaders to justify extreme measures. If the opposition is seen as a threat, then actions taken against it can be framed as necessary for protection. Another important signal is the normalization of behavior that would previously have been considered unacceptable. Statements, actions, or policies that once provoked strong reactions begin to generate less response over time. What was once shocking becomes familiar. This process of normalization reduces resistance. As expectations change, the threshold for concern rises. More significant actions are required to produce the same level of reaction. It is also common for these warning signs to be interpreted in isolation. Each development is considered separately, without recognizing the broader pattern. This fragmented perspective makes it difficult to see the cumulative effect. The system appears to be functioning, even as its underlying structure is changing. Perhaps the most important characteristic of early warning signs is their ambiguity. They do not provide definitive proof that a democracy is in danger. They can often be explained in multiple ways. This uncertainty leads to hesitation. People wait for clearer evidence, more obvious signals, or more direct consequences. By the time those appear, the situation may already have advanced significantly. Recognizing early warning signs requires a shift in perspective. It involves looking beyond individual events and considering their broader implications. It requires attention to patterns, not just outcomes. Most importantly, it requires a willingness to question assumptions. The stability of a democracy should not be taken as evidence that it is immune to change. The absence of crisis should not be interpreted as proof of security. Early warning signs are often present long before a system reaches a point of visible instability. They are the first indications that something is changing. Whether they are noticed or ignored can determine what happens next. Chapter 5. When trust begins to crack. Trust is the invisible foundation of every democracy. It cannot be seen, measured precisely, or enforced by law, yet without it, the entire system becomes unstable. Citizens must trust that elections are fair, that institutions act impartially, and that leaders, even when flawed, operate within accepted limits. Without this basic confidence, the structure of democracy begins to weaken from within. At first, trust does not collapse suddenly. It begins to crack. These cracks often appear in subtle ways. A controversial election result raises doubts among a portion of the population. A judicial decision is perceived as politically motivated. A scandal exposes misconduct among public officials. Each event on its own may seem manageable, but collectively they begin to shift public perception. People start to question what was once assumed. Trust is not only about believing that systems work, it is also about believing that they work fairly. When citizens feel that rules are applied unevenly, or that certain individuals are above accountability, confidence begins to erode. Even the perception of unfairness can be as damaging as actual corruption. Over time, suspicion replaces confidence. This shift has profound consequences. When trust declines, cooperation becomes more difficult. Citizens are less willing to accept decisions, especially those that do not align with their preferences. Electoral outcomes are challenged more frequently. Institutional authority is questioned more aggressively. The system begins to lose its ability to resolve conflicts peacefully. Political leaders may contribute to this erosion, intentionally or otherwise. By questioning the legitimacy of institutions, attacking opponents, or promoting unverified claims, they can deepen divisions and amplify doubt. What begins as a strategic effort to gain support can evolve into a broader loss of confidence in the system itself. Once trust is weakened, it is difficult to restore. Institutions may continue to function, but their authority becomes fragile. Decisions are no longer accepted as neutral or legitimate. Every action is interpreted through a lens of suspicion. In such an environment, even routine processes can trigger conflict. Trust, once fractured, rarely returns to its original state. The danger is not only that people lose faith in specific institutions, but that they lose faith in the idea of the system as a whole. When this happens, democracy no longer serves as a shared framework. Instead, it becomes a contested space in which each group seeks advantage. This is the point at which stability begins to give way to uncertainty. The cracks in trust may be small at first, but they signal a deeper shift. They indicate that the underlying cohesion of the system is weakening. If left unaddressed, these fractures can expand, eventually undermining the very possibility of collective governance. Democracy depends on trust not because it is perfect, but because it requires belief. When that belief begins to fade, the system enters a far more vulnerable phase. Chapter 6: The Role of Citizen Complacency. Democracy demands participation, but it often produces complacency. When systems function smoothly, when rights are protected, and when daily life remains stable, citizens feel little urgency to engage. Politics becomes distant, something managed by others. Attention shifts to personal concerns, careers, families, and routines. The system continues to operate, and its stability is taken as evidence that it requires little effort to maintain. This is the paradox of democratic success. The more stable a democracy appears, the less actively it is protected. Complacency does not emerge from indifference alone. It often develops from confidence. People believe that institutions are strong enough to withstand pressure, that rules are firmly established, and that leaders will respect boundaries. This belief reduces the perceived need for vigilance. Over time, engagement declines, voter turnout may decrease, public debate becomes less informed, fewer people follow political developments closely. Decisions that shape the future of the system receive limited attention. The mechanisms of democracy remain in place, but the level of active participation diminishes. This creates an imbalance. While citizens become less engaged, those seeking power often become more determined. Political actors who are willing to push boundaries encounter less resistance. Changes that might once have provoked widespread concern pass with minimal reaction. Complacency creates space for transformation. It also affects how warning signs are interpreted. When concerning developments occur, they are often dismissed as temporary or insignificant. People assume that the system will correct itself, that institutions will intervene if necessary, and that serious threats will be obvious. This assumption can be misleading. Democratic decline rarely announces itself clearly. It unfolds gradually, often within the boundaries of existing rules. Without active attention, these changes can go unnoticed until they reach a more advanced stage. Complacency also weakens accountability. Leaders are less likely to face scrutiny when citizens are disengaged. Media coverage may lose depth. Public pressure decreases. In such an environment, decisions can be made with fewer consequences. The absence of oversight allows behavior that would otherwise be challenged to become normalized. Another important aspect is the psychological dimension. People tend to avoid situations that create discomfort or uncertainty. Recognizing that a democratic system may be under threat requires confronting complex and unsettling realities. It is often easier to assume that concerns are exaggerated than to accept that stability may be fragile. This tendency reinforces passivity. Complacency is not always visible. It does not require active support for harmful actions. It is often expressed through inaction, through silence, through the absence of response. Yet its effects can be significant. A democracy with disengaged citizens becomes easier to reshape. Participation is not limited to voting. It includes staying informed, engaging in public discourse, and holding leaders accountable. These activities sustain the system by ensuring that power remains responsive to the people. When they decline, the balance shifts. Democracy does not fail only because of those who actively undermine it. It can also fail because of those who assume it will endure without their involvement. Complacency, in this sense, is not neutral. It is a condition that allows change to occur without resistance. It reduces the capacity of society to respond to emerging challenges. It creates an environment in which the gradual erosion of democratic principles can proceed with limited opposition. The stability of a democracy depends not only on its institutions but on the engagement of its citizens. When that engagement fades, so does a crucial layer of protection. Chapter 7. The Slow Erosion of Norms. Not all rules in a democracy are written. Alongside formal laws and constitutions, there exists a set of unwritten expectations, norms that guide behavior and shape the conduct of political actors. These norms define what is acceptable, what is expected, and what is considered beyond the limits of proper action. They are rarely codified, yet they are essential. Norms include practices such as respecting the independence of institutions, accepting electoral outcomes, avoiding the abuse of power, and treating political opponents as legitimate participants in the system. They provide a framework that ensures stability even when laws leave room for interpretation. Without these norms, the system becomes vulnerable. The erosion of norms is often one of the earliest stages of democratic decline. It does not occur through a single event, but through a series of small departures from established behavior. A leader may take an action that pushes the boundaries of what is considered acceptable. If this action is not challenged, it sets a precedent. Over time, these precedents accumulate. Each deviation makes the next one easier. What was once seen as exceptional becomes more common. The standards that once guided behavior begin to shift. Actions that would previously have been criticized are accepted, tolerated, or even defended. This process is gradual and often difficult to detect. Because norms are unwritten, their violation does not always produce immediate consequences. There may be no legal mechanism to prevent or punish the behavior. Instead, enforcement depends on public reaction, institutional resistance, and the willingness of others to uphold established standards. When these responses are weak, norms lose their strength. The erosion of norms can be accelerated by political competition. In highly polarized environments, actors may justify extreme measures as necessary to counter perceived threats. If one side abandons a norm, the other may feel compelled to do the same in order to remain competitive. This creates a cycle of escalation. As norms weaken, the constraints on behavior diminish. Leaders gain greater flexibility to act in ways that concentrate power or undermine institutions. The system begins to rely more heavily on formal rules, which may not be sufficient to prevent abuse. Eventually, even those rules may come under pressure. One of the most significant dangers of norm erosion is that it changes expectations. When certain behaviors become common, they are no longer seen as violations. New standards emerge, often less restrictive than those they replace. This shift can occur without widespread awareness. People adjust to the new reality. What once seemed unacceptable becomes part of the normal political landscape. Resistance decreases, not because the changes are harmless, but because they are familiar. The erosion of norms does not immediately destroy a democracy. Institutions may continue to function. Elections may still take place. Laws may still be enforced. However, the character of the system begins to change. The safeguards that once limited power become less effective. The balance that once defined democratic governance begins to weaken. Norms act as a first line of defense. When they erode, the system loses an important layer of protection. What remains is more exposed, more dependent on formal structures, and more vulnerable to further change. Understanding the role of norms reveals an important truth. Democracy is not sustained by rules alone. It depends on the willingness of individuals and institutions to respect limits, even when they have the ability to exceed them. When that willingness declines, the process of erosion begins. Chapter 8. When laws stop being respected. Laws are the visible framework of a democracy. They define rights, establish limits, and provide a structure within which power is exercised. In principle, they apply equally to all individuals, regardless of position or influence. This equality is essential. It ensures that authority is constrained and that citizens are protected. But laws are only effective when they are respected. Respect for the law goes beyond formal compliance. It involves a shared understanding that rules matter, that they should be followed not only out of obligation, but out of recognition of their role in maintaining order and fairness. When this respect begins to decline, the system becomes unstable. The process often begins gradually. Leaders may test the limits of legal frameworks, exploring what is possible within or just beyond the boundaries. Actions may be justified through technical interpretations, loopholes, or exceptional circumstances. At first, these actions may not appear to violate the law directly, but they challenge its spirit. As these challenges increase, the distinction between legal and acceptable behavior begins to blur. If actions that undermine fairness are technically permitted, they may still weaken the system. Over time, the emphasis shifts from respecting the purpose of the law to exploiting its details. This shift has consequences. Institutions responsible for enforcing the law may come under pressure. Courts may face political influence. Law enforcement agencies may be directed selectively. Decisions that should be impartial become influenced by external considerations. The perception of equality before the law begins to fade. When citizens observe that laws are applied inconsistently, their own willingness to comply may decline. If some individuals or groups appear to operate above the law, others may question why they should adhere to it. This dynamic can lead to a broader erosion of legal culture. Respect for the law is replaced by calculation. People begin to follow rules not because they believe in them, but because of the potential consequences of violation. If enforcement is weak or selective, compliance decreases. The system becomes less predictable, less fair, and less stable. Another critical factor is accountability. In a functioning democracy, violations of the law are addressed through established procedures. Investigations are conducted, responsibility is determined, and consequences are applied. When this process is disrupted, the authority of the law is weakened. Impunity becomes a risk. If individuals in positions of power are not held accountable for their actions, it sends a clear signal. It suggests that rules can be ignored without consequence. This perception can spread beyond the political sphere, affecting broader social behavior. The law loses its credibility. It is important to recognize that the breakdown of legal respect does not require the removal of laws. The framework may remain intact. Legal texts may be unchanged. What shifts is the relationship between those laws and the people they govern. The system continues to exist, but its effectiveness declines. This stage is particularly dangerous because it may not be immediately visible. From the outside, institutions still function. Procedures are still followed. Decisions are still issued. Yet the underlying integrity of the system is compromised. The law becomes a tool rather than a standard. It can be used to justify actions and to target opponents or to protect those in power. Its role as a neutral framework is diminished. This transformation alters the balance of the system, concentrating authority and reducing accountability. Democracy depends on more than the existence of laws. It depends on a collective commitment to uphold them, to respect their purpose, and to apply them fairly. When that commitment weakens, the legal foundation of the system begins to erode, and without that foundation, the stability of democracy cannot be sustained. Chapter 9. The First Small Lies. Democracy does not begin to collapse with obvious falsehoods. It begins with small lies. These are not the kind of lies that immediately provoke outrage or disbelief. They are subtle, often plausible, and sometimes even dismissed as harmless exaggerations. They may involve minor distortions of facts, selective presentation of information, or statements that are technically defensible but fundamentally misleading. At first, they seem insignificant. In political life, a certain level of exaggeration has always existed. Campaign promises are often optimistic. Public statements may simplify complex realities. Citizens, to some extent, expect this. It is part of the accepted rhythm of political communication, but the first small lies are different. They are not simply attempts to persuade, they are tests of tolerance. They measure how much distortion the public is willing to accept without reaction. Each unchallenged falsehood establishes a new baseline, shifting expectations slightly further away from truth. This process is gradual. A misleading statement is made and goes largely uncorrected. A false claim is repeated until it gains familiarity. A contradiction is ignored. None of these moments on their own appear decisive. Yet together they begin to reshape the relationship between truth and public discourse. Accuracy becomes less important than repetition. As small lies accumulate, they begin to influence perception. People may not fully believe them, but they begin to doubt what is true. Uncertainty grows. Facts become less stable, more open to interpretation. In this environment, clarity is replaced by confusion. This shift benefits those who rely on manipulation. When truth is weakened, accountability becomes more difficult. It is harder to challenge decisions, harder to evaluate policies, and harder to hold leaders responsible. Without a shared understanding of reality, public debate loses its foundation. The first small lies also change expectations of leadership. When dishonesty is tolerated at a low level, it becomes easier to accept it at a higher level. Standards decline. What would once have been disqualifying becomes acceptable. The line between truth and falsehood becomes less distinct. This normalization is critical. It does not require that everyone believe the lies. It only requires that enough people stop reacting to them. Silence, in this context, becomes a form of acceptance. The absence of consequence allows the behavior to continue. Over time, the scale of falsehoods can increase. What begins as minor distortion can evolve into more significant deception. Claims become bolder, less constrained by evidence. The response, however, may remain limited because the process of adjustment has already taken place. People have become accustomed. Another important aspect is repetition. Small lies are often repeated consistently across different platforms and contexts. With repetition, they gain familiarity. Familiarity can create a sense of credibility, even in the absence of evidence. This is not a sudden transformation, but a steady one. The danger lies not only in the content of the lies, but in their cumulative effect. Each falsehood weakens the expectation of truthfulness. Each unchallenged claim reduces the cost of dishonesty. The system begins to adapt to a lower standard. Eventually, the distinction between truth and falsehood becomes less central to public life. At that point, the role of information changes. It is no longer primarily a means of understanding reality. It becomes a tool for influence, for shaping perception, and for maintaining power. The first small lies are rarely recognized as significant. They do not appear as threats to democracy. They are seen as part of ordinary politics, as minor deviations that do not require serious attention. This perception allows them to pass without resistance. Yet they mark the beginning of a deeper shift. They indicate that the standards governing public discourse are changing. They reveal that truth is becoming less secure, and they create the conditions in which more substantial distortions can take hold. Democracy depends on a shared commitment to reality. When that commitment begins to weaken, even in small ways, the consequences can extend far beyond the initial moment. The first small lies are not the end of the process. They are the beginning. Chapter 10. When Leaders Test Boundaries. In every democracy, there are limits. Some are written into law. Others exist as norms, expectations, and traditions. Together, they define the boundaries within which power is exercised. These boundaries are essential. They ensure that authority remains constrained and that no individual or group can dominate the system. But boundaries only function when they are respected. At certain moments, leaders begin to test them. These tests are rarely dramatic. They do not usually involve outright violations of the law or open rejection of the system. Instead, they take the form of actions that push against existing limits, carefully, strategically, and often with plausible justification. A rule is stretched, a precedent is challenged, a decision is made that falls just within or just beyond what is considered acceptable. Each test serves a purpose. It is not only about achieving a specific outcome, it is also about observing the reaction. Will institutions resist? Will the public respond? Will there be consequences? The answers to these questions determine what comes next. If the response is strong, the boundary may hold. If the response is weak, the boundary begins to shift. This is how limits are redefined. When a boundary is crossed without significant consequence, it loses its force. What was once prohibited becomes possible. What was once unthinkable becomes part of the range of available actions. The system adjusts, often without formal acknowledgement. Over time, these adjustments accumulate. Leaders who test boundaries successfully gain confidence. They learn that constraints are flexible, that resistance can be managed, and that the cost of pushing further may be lower than expected. Each successful test encourages the next. This creates a pattern of escalation. Actions that once seemed extreme become normal. New boundaries are tested, often more aggressively than before. The pace of change may increase as the limits that once restrained behavior become less effective. Institutions play a critical role in this process. Courts, legislatures, and oversight bodies are designed to enforce limits and maintain balance. When they respond firmly to boundary testing, they reinforce the system. When they hesitate, delay, or fail to act, they create opportunities for further expansion of power. Their response sends a signal. It communicates whether the system is capable of defending itself. It shapes the expectations of both leaders and citizens. A strong response can deter future challenges. A weak response can invite them. Public reaction is equally important. Democratic systems rely not only on formal mechanisms, but on societal expectations. When citizens recognize boundary testing as a threat and respond accordingly, they contribute to the preservation of limits. When they remain passive, the process continues with fewer obstacles. Attention and awareness are therefore essential. One of the challenges is that boundary testing is often framed as legitimate action. Leaders may present their decisions as necessary, lawful, or even beneficial. They may argue that existing limits are outdated, inefficient, or unfair. These arguments can be persuasive. They create ambiguity, making it difficult to determine whether a boundary has truly been crossed. This uncertainty can delay response, allowing the change to take hold. Another factor is normalization. As boundaries are tested repeatedly, the initial sense of concern diminishes. What once appeared unusual becomes familiar. The threshold for reaction rises. More significant actions are required to produce the same level of response. This gradual shift reduces resistance. The system continues to function, but within altered limits. Power becomes more concentrated. Constraints become less effective. The balance that defines democracy begins to change. Boundary testing does not immediately destroy a democratic system. It reshapes it. The transformation occurs step by step through actions that are often small in isolation but significant in combination. By the time the full effect becomes visible, the underlying structure may already have been altered. Understanding this process is essential. It reveals that the stability of democracy depends not only on the existence of limits, but on their consistent enforcement. Boundaries are not self-sustaining. They require recognition, defense, and when necessary, reinforcement. When leaders test boundaries, they are not only pursuing power, they are also discovering how far the system can be pushed. The answer to that question determines what the system will become. Part 2. Power begins to shift. Chapter 11. The rise of strong leaders. In times of uncertainty, strong leaders become especially appealing. Democracy by design is often slow. It requires debate, compromise, negotiation, and the balancing of competing interests. While this process is essential for fairness and stability, it can also appear inefficient, particularly during periods of crisis or rapid change. When people feel that the system is not delivering results, they begin to look for alternatives. This is where strong leaders emerge. A strong leader presents a different model of governance. Instead of complexity, they offer simplicity. Instead of compromise, they promise decisive action. They speak with confidence, often with certainty, and project an image of control in situations that feel chaotic or unpredictable. This appeal is powerful. For citizens who are frustrated with political gridlock, economic hardship, or social instability, the promise of swift and effective leadership can be deeply attractive. The idea that one person can cut through obstacles and deliver results offers a sense of clarity and direction. However, this clarity often comes at a cost. Strong leaders tend to view constraints as obstacles rather than safeguards. Institutions that limit their authority may be portrayed as inefficient or unnecessary. Processes designed to ensure accountability may be criticized as barriers to progress. Over time, the emphasis shifts from shared governance to centralized authority. This shift does not always occur abruptly. In many cases, strong leaders gain power through legitimate means. They win elections, build support, and present themselves as representatives of the popular will. Their authority is initially grounded in democratic processes, but once in power, their approach to leadership begins to reshape the system. Decision-making becomes more concentrated. Dissent may be discouraged. Opposition is often framed not as a normal part of democracy, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The narrative changes from collective governance to personal leadership. The leader becomes the focal point. Supporters may come to see the leader not just as a political figure, but as a symbol of stability or national identity. Loyalty shifts from institutions to individuals. This personalization of power weakens the broader framework of democracy. Institutions are designed to function regardless of who holds office. When power becomes tied to a single figure, that stability is reduced. The system becomes more dependent on the actions and intentions of one person. This increases the risk of imbalance. Another important aspect is the expectation of results. Strong leaders often promise rapid change. When those expectations are not met, the pressure to deliver can lead to further concentration of power. Additional authority may be justified as necessary to achieve goals. Limits may be pushed in the name of efficiency. The cycle reinforces itself. The more power is concentrated, the more the system changes. The role of institutions diminishes. The space for opposition narrows. The balance that defines democratic governance begins to shift. It is important to recognize that the rise of strong leaders does not occur in isolation. It is often a response to real concerns. Economic difficulties, social divisions, and political dissatisfaction can all contribute to the demand for decisive leadership. The appeal of strength is rooted in a desire for stability and improvement. But strength, when it overrides structure, can lead to imbalance. Democracy depends not on the strength of a single leader, but on the strength of its institutions. It requires limits, accountability, and shared responsibility. When these elements are weakened, the system becomes more vulnerable. The rise of strong leaders is therefore a critical moment. It reflects both the needs of the public and the risks to the system. How that moment is managed can shape the future of the democracy itself. Chapter 12. Charisma versus competence. Leadership is often judged by what is seen, not what is done. In democratic systems where public support is essential, perception plays a significant role. Charisma, the ability to attract, inspire, and persuade, can be a powerful asset. It allows leaders to connect with audiences, to communicate effectively, and to build broad support. But charisma and competence are not the same. Charisma is about presentation. Competence is about performance. A charismatic leader can command attention, deliver compelling speeches, and create a strong personal image. They can simplify complex issues, speak with confidence, and generate enthusiasm among supporters. These qualities can be highly effective in gaining and maintaining power. Competence, however, requires a different set of skills. It involves understanding complex systems, making informed decisions, managing institutions, and addressing challenges with practical solutions. Competence is often less visible. It is measured not by words, but by outcomes. The distinction between the two is critical. In stable periods, competence tends to be valued. Effective governance, sound policy, and institutional stability are recognized as essential. However, during times of uncertainty or dissatisfaction, charisma can become more influential. People may prioritize how a leader makes them feel over how effectively they govern. This shift can have significant consequences. Charismatic leaders are often able to build strong personal followings. Their communication style creates a sense of connection and trust. Supporters may feel that the leader understands them, represents them, and speaks on their behalf. This emotional connection can outweigh objective evaluation. Decisions that might otherwise be questioned are accepted. Mistakes may be overlooked. Criticism may be dismissed. The leader's image becomes more important than their actions. This dynamic can weaken accountability. When support is based primarily on charisma, it becomes less dependent on performance. Leaders may face less pressure to deliver results or to adhere to established standards. The balance between authority and responsibility begins to shift. Another important factor is simplicity. Charismatic leaders often present complex issues in simple terms. They offer clear explanations and direct solutions. This approach can be appealing, particularly when people are seeking clarity in uncertain situations. However, simplicity can come at the expense of accuracy. Complex problems rarely have simple solutions. When they are presented as such, the gap between expectation and reality can widen. Addressing that gap may require difficult decisions, compromises, or long-term strategies, none of which align easily with the expectations created by charismatic messaging. Over time, this can lead to frustration. To manage that frustration, leaders may rely more heavily on communication than on policy. Emphasis may shift from solving problems to shaping perception. The role of narrative becomes more prominent. Competence becomes secondary. This does not mean that charismatic leaders are incapable of effective governance. In some cases, charisma and competence can coexist. However, when the balance shifts too far toward image and away from substance, the quality of decision-making can decline. The system begins to rely more on persuasion than on performance. Democracy depends on informed choice. For citizens, this requires the ability to distinguish between appearance and effectiveness. It requires evaluating leaders not only by how they speak, but by how they govern. When this distinction is blurred, the selection process becomes less reliable. The result is a leadership dynamic that prioritizes visibility over capability. In such an environment, the long-term stability of the system can be affected. Charisma can win power. Competence is required to sustain it. Chapter 13. Promises that sound too good. In every democratic system, promises are a central part of political life. Candidates present plans, outline goals, and describe the changes they intend to achieve. These promises are meant to inform voters and provide a basis for choice. Ideally, they are grounded in reality, reflecting both ambition and feasibility, but not all promises are equal. Some are designed not to inform, but to attract. They are crafted to appeal to desires, frustrations, and expectations, often without regard for practical limitations. These are the promises that sound too good to be true. They are simple, direct, and highly appealing. They offer solutions that appear immediate and comprehensive. Complex problems are reduced to clear outcomes. Difficult trade-offs are minimized or ignored. The message is one of certainty. Change will be rapid, effective, and beneficial for all. This type of promise has strong appeal, particularly in times of dissatisfaction. When people feel that existing systems are not meeting their needs, they become more receptive to bold claims. The desire for improvement can outweigh concerns about feasibility. Hope becomes a powerful motivator. However, unrealistic promises create risks. They establish expectations that may be difficult or impossible to meet. When these expectations are not fulfilled, trust can decline. Disappointment can lead to frustration, which may then be directed toward institutions, opponents, or the system itself. This dynamic can destabilize the political environment. Leaders who rely on such promises may face pressure to deliver results quickly. When reality does not align with expectations, they may seek alternative ways to maintain support. This can include shifting responsibility, redefining goals, or increasing control over information. The focus moves from delivery to justification. Another consequence is the distortion of public debate. When unrealistic promises dominate, more measured and realistic proposals may receive less attention. Practical solutions can appear less appealing in comparison. This shifts the overall standard of political discourse. The emphasis moves toward what is desirable rather than what is achievable. Over time, this can affect how citizens evaluate leadership. Expectations become less grounded in practical considerations. The gap between promise and performance becomes more pronounced. This gap creates instability. It can also contribute to polarization. Supporters may continue to believe in the promises, attributing failures to external factors. Opponents may view the promises as evidence of dishonesty or manipulation. The difference in perception can deepen divisions. The system becomes more fragmented. It is important to understand that the appeal of such promises is not irrational. They often address real concerns and genuine needs. The problem lies not in the desire for change, but in the disconnect between promise and possibility. Democracy requires informed choice. For that choice to be meaningful, it must be based on realistic expectations. When promises move too far from reality, the ability to evaluate options effectively is reduced. The result is a political environment in which attraction outweighs accuracy. Promises that sound too good can win support, but they can also undermine the conditions needed to sustain trust and stability. Chapter 14. Exploiting Public Fear. Fear is one of the most powerful forces in political life. It shapes perception, influences behavior, and can alter priorities in ways that are both immediate and profound. In democratic systems where public opinion plays a central role, fear can become a decisive factor. When people feel threatened, their focus changes. Concerns about stability, security, and survival begin to outweigh other considerations. In such moments, the desire for protection can override the usual emphasis on rights, procedures, and limitations. The balance between freedom and security shifts. This creates an opportunity. Leaders who understand the dynamics of fear can use it to build support and justify actions that might otherwise face resistance. By emphasizing threats, whether real, perceived, or exaggerated, they can shape public perception and influence decision-making. The framing of risk becomes critical. A situation presented as manageable may not generate strong reaction. The same situation described as urgent or dangerous can produce a very different response. Language, imagery, and repetition all contribute to how fear is perceived. Over time, this perception can become entrenched. When fear is sustained, it changes expectations. People become more willing to accept measures that promise security, even if those measures limit certain freedoms. Policies that would normally be questioned may be supported if they are presented as necessary for protection. This is where the balance begins to shift. Emergency powers, increased surveillance, restrictions on movement or expression. These actions may be justified as temporary responses to specific threats. In some cases, they may be necessary. However, when fear persists, such measures can become normalized. Temporary solutions become permanent. Another important aspect is the identification of threats. Fear is often directed towards specific groups, ideas, or external forces. These targets may be defined broadly or narrowly, but they serve to focus attention and create a sense of urgency. By identifying a clear source of danger, leaders can unify support and reduce opposition. This process can simplify complex issues. However, it can also distort reality. When fear is amplified, nuance is reduced. Alternative perspectives may be dismissed. Debate becomes more difficult, as questioning the response can be interpreted as ignoring the threat. This limits discussion. Fear also affects how information is received. In heightened states of concern, people may rely more on immediate impressions than on detailed analysis. Messages that reinforce existing fears are more likely to be accepted. This can make it easier to shape public opinion through selective information. The environment becomes more reactive. In such conditions, the role of institutions may change. Actions taken in response to fear can expand authority and reduce oversight. The urgency of the situation can be used to justify bypassing standard procedures. The system adapts to the perceived threat. The challenge is that fear, once established, is difficult to reverse. Even when the original cause diminishes, the structures and expectations created in response may remain. The system does not always return to its previous state. This creates long-term effects. Democracy depends on balance between freedom and security, between authority and accountability. Fear can disrupt this balance, shifting it toward control. Understanding how fear operates is essential. It reveals not only how decisions are influenced, but how systems can change under pressure. Fear itself is not inherently negative. It can prompt necessary action and awareness. The risk lies in how it is used. When fear is exploited rather than addressed, it becomes a tool. And in the hands of those seeking power, it can reshape the system in lasting ways. Chapter 15. Dividing us versus them. One of the most powerful tools in political strategy is division. Democracy depends on pluralism, the coexistence of different views, identities, and interests within a shared system. Disagreement is not only expected, it is essential. It allows for debate, compromise, and the representation of diverse perspectives. But when disagreement turns into division, the system begins to change. The distinction between us and them is not new. It exists in many forms shaped by culture, identity, and experience. However, in a healthy democracy, these differences are managed within a common framework. Opposing groups recognize each other as legitimate participants in the same system. This recognition is crucial. When it begins to fade, division intensifies. Political language starts to shift. Opponents are no longer described simply as people with different ideas, but as fundamentally different in character, values, or intentions. The emphasis moves from disagreement to separation. We represent what is right. They represent what is wrong. This framing simplifies complex realities. It reduces political debate to a binary choice where nuance is lost and compromise becomes more difficult. The space between positions narrows, and the possibility of common ground diminishes. Over time, identity becomes more important than policy. People align themselves not only with ideas but with groups. Loyalty to the group strengthens, while openness to alternative perspectives declines. Information is interpreted through the lens of belonging. What matters is not only what is said, but who says it. This dynamic reinforces division. Leaders may actively encourage this process. By emphasizing differences and highlighting conflicts, they can consolidate support. A divided society is easier to mobilize as each group becomes more cohesive and more responsive to messages that reinforce its identity. Division creates clarity, but at a cost. When society is divided into us and them, trust declines. Cooperation becomes more difficult. Institutions that depend on broad support face increasing pressure. The shared framework that sustains democracy begins to weaken. The consequences extend beyond politics. Social relationships are affected. Families, communities, and workplaces may reflect the same divisions seen in public life. Conversations become more tense. Disagreement becomes more personal. The sense of a shared society begins to erode. This environment changes how decisions are made. Policies are evaluated not only on their merits, but on who supports them. Actions taken by one group are viewed with suspicion by the other. Even neutral institutions may be perceived as aligned with one side or the other. The system becomes polarized. Polarization does not necessarily lead to immediate collapse. Democracies can function with a degree of division. However, when division becomes the dominant feature of political life, the capacity for cooperation declines. Without cooperation, governance becomes more difficult. Important decisions may be delayed or avoided. Compromise may be seen as weakness. Leaders may prioritize maintaining group support over addressing broader issues. The focus shifts from solving problems to winning conflicts. This shift has long-term implications. A society divided into us and them loses its sense of collective purpose. The idea of a shared future becomes less clear. The willingness to accept outcomes that do not fully align with one's preferences declines. Democracy relies on the ability to coexist despite differences. When division replaces coexistence, the system enters a more fragile state. The language of us and them may appear simple, even effective, but its impact is profound. It reshapes how people see each other, how they engage with the system, and how the system itself functions. In the long run, division is not just a strategy. It is a transformation. Chapter 16. Attacking Political Opponents. In a democracy, political opposition is not a weakness. It is a necessity. Opposition provides balance, scrutiny, and alternative perspectives. It ensures that those in power are held accountable and that decisions are subject to debate. Without opposition, democracy loses one of its core mechanisms of self-correction. But the role of opposition can change. When political competition intensifies, opponents may no longer be treated as legitimate participants in the system. Instead, they become targets. Criticism shifts from ideas to individuals. The focus moves from debate to discrediting. This is where the nature of political conflict begins to transform. Attacks on political opponents can take many forms. They may involve questioning motives, highlighting personal flaws, or associating individuals with negative labels. In some cases, these attacks may be grounded in real concerns. In others, they may be exaggerated or misleading. The distinction is not always clear. What matters is the overall effect. When attacks become frequent and aggressive, they change the tone of political discourse. Respect declines, dialogue becomes more difficult, the possibility of constructive engagement diminishes. Opponents are no longer seen as rivals to be debated, but as obstacles to be removed. This shift can be reinforced by public messaging. Leaders and supporters may repeat narratives that portray opponents as harmful, dishonest, or dangerous. Over time, these narratives can shape perception, influencing how individuals and groups are viewed. Repetition strengthens belief. As these perceptions take hold, the threshold for acceptable behavior changes. Actions that would previously have been considered inappropriate may become normalized. Personal attacks, once criticized, may be accepted as part of political strategy. The standards of discourse decline. This has implications for governance. When opposition is weakened or delegitimized, the balance of the system is affected. Fewer voices challenge decisions. Fewer perspectives are considered. The quality of debate declines and the risk of error increases. Accountability is reduced. Another consequence is the impact on public trust. If opponents are consistently portrayed as untrustworthy or harmful, citizens may lose confidence not only in specific individuals, but in the broader political process. The system may come to be seen as inherently flawed or corrupt. This perception can lead to disengagement. Alternatively, it can lead to increased conflict. Supporters of different groups may adopt similar attitudes, viewing each other with suspicion or hostility. The political environment becomes more confrontational. The space for compromise narrows. It is important to recognize that disagreement is not the issue. Democracy depends on disagreement. The challenge arises when disagreement is replaced by hostility, and when opponents are no longer recognized as legitimate participants in a shared system. At that point, the nature of politics changes. Attacking political opponents may provide short-term advantage. It can mobilize support, draw attention, and create clear distinctions. But it also weakens the structures that allow democracy to function effectively. In the long term, the cost can be significant. A system without meaningful opposition is not balanced. A system in which opposition is constantly undermined is not stable. Democracy requires not only competition, but respect. When that respect is lost, the system becomes more fragile. Chapter 17. Blaming minorities and outsiders. In times of uncertainty, societies often look for explanations. Economic difficulties, social change, and political instability create pressure. People seek to understand why conditions are worsening or why expectations are not being met. These questions are natural. The answers, however, can take different forms. One of the most persistent patterns is the tendency to assign blame to minorities and outsiders. This process is not new. It has appeared in many contexts, across different periods of history. It is a response that simplifies complex problems by identifying a specific group as the source of difficulty. The appeal of this approach is clear. It provides a clear explanation. It offers a target for frustration. It creates a sense of unity among those who are not included in the defined group. By identifying others as responsible, attention is redirected away from broader structural issues. This redirection can be powerful. Leaders may reinforce this narrative by highlighting differences, emphasizing perceived threats, or associating certain groups with negative outcomes. These messages can be framed in various ways: economic, cultural, or security-related. The underlying pattern remains consistent. A group is defined as separate. It is associated with problems. It becomes the focus of concern. This process can influence public perception. As narratives are repeated, they shape how people understand events. Complex issues are reduced to simpler explanations. The role of broader factors may be minimized or ignored. The focus remains on the identified group. This has consequences. Blaming minorities and outsiders can lead to increased tension and division. It can justify policies that limit rights or restrict participation. It can alter the balance of the system by redefining who is fully included and who is not. In a democracy, inclusion is fundamental. All citizens are meant to have equal standing under the law. When certain groups are treated differently, this principle is weakened. The system becomes less representative and less fair. Another important aspect is the effect on accountability. When problems are attributed to specific groups, attention is diverted from decision-makers and institutions. Responsibility is shifted away from those in positions of power. This can reduce pressure for effective governance. The focus moves from solutions to blame. This shift can persist even when evidence does not support the claims being made. Narratives, once established, can be difficult to change. They may continue to influence perception, even in the face of contradictory information. The result is a distorted understanding of reality. It is also important to consider the broader impact on society. When certain groups are consistently portrayed as responsible for problems, it affects social cohesion. Trust declines. Relationships become strained. The sense of shared identity is weakened. This environment can be difficult to reverse. The normalization of blame changes expectations. What begins as rhetoric can influence policy, behavior, and attitudes. Over time, these changes can become embedded in the system. Democracy depends on the principle that all members of society are part of a shared framework. When that framework is divided into insiders and outsiders, its integrity is affected. Blaming minorities and outsiders may provide simple answers, but those answers often come at the expense of accuracy, fairness, and stability. In the long run, they do not resolve underlying problems. They reshape the system in ways that make those problems more difficult to address. Chapter 18. The Language of Hate. Language does more than describe reality. It shapes it. In democratic societies, language is the primary tool through which ideas are expressed, debated, and understood. It allows for disagreement, persuasion, and compromise. The tone and content of public language influence not only what people think, but how they think. When that language begins to change, the system begins to change with it. The language of hate does not always appear suddenly. It often emerges gradually through subtle shifts in tone and emphasis. Words that were once considered unacceptable begin to appear more frequently. Descriptions become harsher, more absolute, and more dehumanizing. Opponents are no longer simply wrong. They are portrayed as dangerous, corrupt, or even less than fully human. This transformation is significant. It alters the way individuals and groups are perceived, making it easier to justify exclusion, hostility, or even harm. The power of language lies in repetition. When certain terms and phrases are used consistently, they begin to feel normal. What once shocked becomes familiar. The emotional impact of harsh language diminishes over time, even as its influence grows. Normalization is a critical stage. As the language of hate becomes more common, it spreads beyond political leaders. Media, public figures, and ordinary citizens may begin to adopt similar patterns of speech. The tone of public discourse shifts, becoming more aggressive and less restrained. This shift affects behavior. Language shapes expectations. When aggressive or dehumanizing language is accepted, it lowers the threshold for corresponding actions. Words create a framework within which behavior becomes more conceivable. The connection between language and action is not always direct, but it is significant. Another important aspect is the simplification of complex issues. The language of hate often reduces individuals or groups to single characteristics. It ignores nuance and eliminates context. This simplification makes it easier to assign blame, to create divisions, and to justify exclusion. It replaces understanding with categorization. This process can also influence how information is received. Messages that align with emotionally charged language are more likely to attract attention and be remembered. As a result, they can shape perception more effectively than neutral or balanced communication. Emotion becomes a driver of understanding. In such an environment, rational debate becomes more difficult. Discussions are framed in terms of identity and conflict rather than ideas and solutions. The possibility of compromise decreases as positions become more rigid and more deeply tied to emotional responses. The space for dialogue narrows. It is important to recognize that the language of hate does not only affect those who are targeted, it also affects those who use it and those who hear it. It changes the overall tone of society, influencing how people interact and how they interpret events. It creates a more hostile environment. Democracy depends on a level of mutual recognition and respect. Even in disagreement, there must be an acknowledgement that others are legitimate participants in the system. The language of hate undermines this recognition. It transforms opponents into enemies. This transformation has long-term consequences. It weakens the foundations of cooperation, reduces trust, and increases the potential for conflict. It reshapes the boundaries of acceptable behavior, both in speech and in action. Language is not merely a reflection of political reality. It is a force that helps to create it. When the language of hate becomes normalized, the conditions that sustain democracy begin to erode. Chapter 19. Turning supporters into loyalists. Support is a natural part of democratic politics. Citizens align themselves with parties, leaders, and ideas based on shared beliefs and preferences. This alignment is flexible. It allows for change, for disagreement, and for re-evaluation. Supporters may shift their views, withdraw their backing, or hold leaders accountable when expectations are not met. This flexibility is essential. It ensures that power remains conditional, dependent on performance and responsiveness. It allows the system to adjust and correct itself over time. But support can evolve into something more rigid. When supporters become loyalists, the nature of their relationship with leadership changes. Loyalty is not based primarily on performance or policy. It is based on identification, attachment, and in some cases, unconditional trust. This shift has significant implications. A loyalist is less likely to question decisions, less likely to respond to new information, and less likely to change position. The connection to the leader or group becomes more important than the evaluation of actions or outcomes. Accountability weakens. Leaders may encourage this transformation by emphasizing identity, reinforcing group cohesion, and framing criticism as external attack. They can strengthen loyalty among supporters. Messages that highlight unity and shared purpose can deepen attachment. Over time, this attachment becomes central. Supporters begin to see the leader or movement as representing more than political preference. It becomes associated with identity, values, and belonging. Challenges to the leader are perceived as challenges to the group itself. This perception changes responses. Criticism that might otherwise be considered legitimate is rejected. Information that contradicts established views is dismissed. The boundaries of acceptable opinion narrow within the group. The environment becomes more closed. This shift also affects how decisions are made. When leaders rely on loyalists rather than independent supporters, the feedback they receive may become less balanced. Critical perspectives may be underrepresented. Decisions may be made with less consideration of alternative viewpoints. The quality of governance can be affected. Another consequence is increased polarization. As one group becomes more cohesive and loyal, other groups may respond in similar ways. The overall political environment becomes more divided, with each side reinforcing its own beliefs and identities. Interaction between groups decreases. The transformation from supporter to loyalist does not require explicit instruction. It can develop gradually through repeated messaging, shared experiences, and social reinforcement. Over time, the distinction between independent support and unconditional loyalty becomes less clear. This ambiguity allows the process to continue. It is important to recognize that loyalty itself is not inherently negative. It can provide stability and continuity. The challenge arises when loyalty replaces critical engagement. Democracy depends on the ability of citizens to evaluate, question, and, when necessary, withdraw support. When this ability declines, the balance of the system changes. Power becomes less conditional. Leaders face fewer constraints. The connection between governance and accountability weakens. Turning supporters into loyalists is not a single event. It is a gradual transformation that reshapes the relationship between citizens and power, and in doing so it alters one of the core dynamics of democracy. Chapter 20. When criticism becomes treason. Criticism is a fundamental element of democracy. It allows citizens to question decisions, challenge authority, and express disagreement. It provides a mechanism for accountability, ensuring that those in power remain responsive to the public. Without criticism, the system loses its capacity for self-correction. But the role of criticism can be redefined. When criticism begins to be portrayed as disloyalty, the boundaries of acceptable expression shift. What was once considered a normal part of political life becomes framed as harmful or dangerous. This is where the transformation begins. The term treason carries significant weight. It suggests betrayal, disloyalty, and a threat to the state. When applied to criticism, it changes how dissent is perceived. It moves the discussion from disagreement to accusation. Critics are no longer participants in debate. They are portrayed as adversaries of the system itself. This shift can occur gradually. Leaders may begin by questioning the motives of critics, suggesting that they are acting in bad faith or pursuing hidden agendas. Over time, these suggestions can become more direct, associating criticism with harm to national interests. The language becomes more severe. As this framing takes hold, the response to criticism changes. Instead of being addressed through argument or evidence, it may be dismissed or condemned. The focus moves from engaging with ideas to discrediting those who express them. This reduces the space for dialogue. Public reaction is influenced by this shift. Supporters may adopt similar attitudes, viewing critics with suspicion or hostility. The willingness to consider alternative perspectives declines. Debate becomes more polarized. The environment becomes less open. In such conditions, self-censorship can increase. Individuals may hesitate to express opinions that could be interpreted as disloyal or harmful. This hesitation limits the range of voices in public discourse. The system becomes less responsive. Institutions can also be affected. Media organizations, academic institutions, and other platforms for expression may face pressure to align with dominant narratives. The diversity of viewpoints may decrease. This further narrows discussion. It is important to understand that the framing of criticism as treason does not necessarily involve formal legal changes. The effect can be achieved through language, perception, and social pressure. The boundaries of acceptable expression shift without the need for explicit prohibition. This makes the process less visible. From the outside, the system may still appear open. Criticism may still be possible. However, the conditions under which it occurs have changed. The cost of dissent has increased, even if not formally defined. This alters behavior. Democracy depends on the ability to question power without fear of being labeled as disloyal. It requires an environment in which disagreement is recognized as legitimate, even when it is uncomfortable or challenging. When that environment is weakened, the system changes. The redefinition of criticism is not an isolated development. It is part of a broader pattern in which boundaries shift, norms evolve, and the relationship between citizens and authority is altered. When criticism becomes treason, the space for accountability narrows. And without accountability, the balance that sustains democracy begins to erode. Part 3. Control of Information. Chapter 21. Attacking the Free Press. A free press is one of the cornerstones of democracy. It serves as a watchdog, exposing abuses of power, informing citizens, and providing a platform for debate. Without independent journalism, information becomes centralized, filtered, and vulnerable to manipulation. Citizens are left with fewer tools to make informed decisions. Attacks on the press often begin subtly. Leaders may criticize unfavorable coverage, label reporting as biased, or question the motives of journalists. Initially, these attacks can appear defensive rather than aggressive, framed as protecting the public from misinformation or partisan influence. Over time, the attacks can intensify. Media outlets are painted as enemies, conspirators, or instruments of opposition. The act of reporting factual information becomes politicized, with journalists portrayed not as neutral observers, but as active participants in political conflict. This has profound consequences. Supporters may stop trusting independent sources, relying instead on information sanctioned or produced by aligned entities. Critical scrutiny weakens. Errors in reporting may be dismissed as intentional, even when they are unintentional. Public perception of neutrality erodes. Institutions designed to safeguard accountability begin to falter. When journalists are threatened, harassed, or discredited, their ability to operate independently diminishes. Investigations may be curtailed. Corruption and abuses may go unreported. Information that challenges authority becomes scarce. The erosion of press freedom is gradual but cumulative. At first, only a few outlets may face criticism. Later, broader narratives may emerge, delegitimizing the entire media landscape. Citizens may come to see independent journalism as untrustworthy by default. The implications extend beyond politics. Society relies on reliable reporting to make decisions in public health, education, economy, and security. When trust in information collapses, the ability to respond to crises effectively declines. Decisions are made on incomplete or distorted facts, increasing societal risk. Attacking the press is not just a tactic, it is a structural shift. It transforms how information is perceived, how institutions function, and how citizens engage with reality. Without a free press, democracy loses its ability to self-correct, leaving citizens vulnerable to manipulation. Chapter 22. Spreading Disinformation. Disinformation is deliberate. It is not merely incorrect information. It is strategically designed to mislead, confuse, or manipulate. Its purpose is to shape perception rather than inform. In democratic societies where decision-making depends on informed citizens, disinformation is a powerful weapon. It begins with trust. Disinformation exploits the assumption that information received from media, leaders, or institutions is reliable. Once that assumption is shaken, the boundary between fact and fiction becomes blurred, and citizens are less able to evaluate truth. The methods are varied. False stories, manipulated images, selective reporting, and misleading statistics are combined to create a distorted narrative. These messages are often repeated across multiple channels to increase familiarity, which makes them more likely to be believed. Disinformation is effective because it appeals to emotion. Fear, anger, pride, or hope can override rational evaluation. People are more likely to accept information that confirms existing beliefs or strengthens their group identity, even if it contradicts evidence. It also undermines accountability. When decision-making is influenced by falsehoods, leaders are less likely to face consequences for their actions. Citizens who act on disinformation may inadvertently support policies or decisions they would have otherwise opposed. The effects compound over time. As disinformation spreads, trust in reliable sources erodes. Doubt becomes a tool. Facts are questioned, studies are dismissed, and even widely accepted truths can be cast as partisan constructs. Disinformation reshapes the public sphere. Debate shifts from discussion grounded in reality to argument based on competing narratives. The common ground necessary for democratic compromise begins to shrink. Polarization intensifies. In extreme cases, disinformation can redefine reality itself. When citizens cannot agree on basic facts, collective decision-making becomes nearly impossible. Governance falters. Conflict escalates. Democracy loses one of its fundamental pillars, the shared understanding of truth. Chapter 23. Creating Alternative Truths. Alternative truths are a step beyond disinformation. They are narratives constructed to replace or override reality for a significant portion of the population. Unlike simple lies, alternative truths are comprehensive systems of belief. They offer explanations, context, and justification, often creating a self-consistent but false worldview. The creation of alternative truths relies on repetition and reinforcement. By consistently presenting a narrative as fact through media, speeches, or social networks, leaders can normalize it. Repetition fosters familiarity, which increases credibility in the eyes of many citizens. Alternative truths often exploit existing anxieties and biases. They take advantage of pre-existing fears, grievances, or identities to make the narrative feel plausible. This emotional anchoring strengthens adherence to the false framework, making it resistant to contrary evidence. Supporters begin to reinterpret reality through this lens. Events, policies, and behaviors are judged not by their objective merits, but by how well they fit the constructed narrative. Contradictions are dismissed, reinterpreted, or ignored. Critical thinking is supplanted by loyalty to the narrative. The effect on democracy is profound. When a substantial portion of the population operates under an alternative truth, consensus becomes difficult. Shared understanding, the foundation of collective decision-making, is replaced by competing realities. Institutions that rely on mutual recognition are undermined. Alternative truths also reinforce loyalty and division. Supporters become more committed, while skeptics are dismissed as outsiders or enemies. This dynamic intensifies polarization and reduces the possibility of dialogue. Conflict is not merely about policy. It is about whose version of reality is accepted. The danger lies not only in falsehood, but in the power it grants. Leaders who create alternative truths can justify extraordinary actions, dismiss criticism, and maintain control even in the face of evidence. Their authority is grounded not in competence or legitimacy, but in the ability to define reality for their followers. Democracy depends on shared truths. Without a common factual foundation, debate becomes symbolic rather than substantive, and institutions lose their ability to mediate differences. Alternative truths may be invisible at first, but their long-term impact is destabilizing and profound. Creating alternative truths is not merely a tactic, it is a transformation of the collective understanding of reality, and in doing so, it reshapes the very fabric of democratic society. Chapter 24: Social Media Manipulation. Social media has transformed the way people communicate, access information, and engage with politics. It offers immediacy, reach, and a sense of connection that traditional media cannot match. Yet, this very accessibility makes it vulnerable to manipulation. Manipulation on these platforms is subtle and sophisticated. Algorithms favor engagement over accuracy, promoting content that provokes strong emotional reactions. Misleading headlines, exaggerated claims, and polarizing messages are amplified, reaching millions of users quickly. The lines between opinion, fact, and falsehood blur. Leaders and political actors exploit these dynamics strategically. Targeted messaging, viral campaigns, and echo chambers are designed to reinforce existing beliefs. Social media allows for precision in reaching specific groups, ensuring that narratives resonate with those most receptive. The effect on public perception is profound. Repeated exposure to manipulated content shapes what people see as normal or true. It reinforces biases, deepens divisions, and makes it harder for citizens to evaluate information critically. Trust in neutral sources declines, while loyalty to chosen narratives strengthens. Manipulation also accelerates polarization. When people primarily encounter content aligned with their beliefs, opposing perspectives are dismissed or vilified. The digital environment fosters isolation within ideological silos, reducing opportunities for dialogue and compromise. The impact extends beyond politics. Social media manipulation can influence elections, public opinion, policy debates, and even social behavior. Misinformation spreads faster than correction, creating long-lasting distortions that are difficult to reverse. In this environment, control over information equates to influence over perception. When political actors can manipulate what people see, hear, and share, they shape not only opinions but also expectations, fears, and priorities. Social media becomes a tool of power, not merely a platform for communication. Chapter 25: Silencing Journalists. Independent journalism is essential for democracy, yet it is increasingly under threat. Silencing journalists can take many forms: intimidation, harassment, legal action, economic pressure, or even violence. The goal is to suppress reporting that challenges authority, exposes wrongdoing, or contradicts preferred narratives. This tactic is effective because it targets both content and messenger. When journalists are threatened, the flow of information is disrupted. Stories that might provoke scrutiny or accountability are delayed, altered, or never published. The public loses access to reliable, independent reporting. The chilling effect extends beyond individual journalists. Colleagues and media organizations may self-censor to avoid repercussions. Investigative work declines. Critical questions are deferred. Fear becomes a tool for shaping both coverage and public perception. Silencing journalists also undermines institutional checks. Legislatures, courts, and other oversight bodies rely on independent reporting to identify problems and hold leaders accountable. When journalists are removed from the equation, these mechanisms are weakened. Corruption, abuse, and policy failures are less likely to be exposed. The impact on society is cumulative. As information becomes constrained, citizens are less able to make informed decisions. Public debate narrows, and the ability to respond to crises diminishes. Trust in media erodes, particularly when state-aligned or partisan outlets dominate the narrative. In the end, silencing journalists is not only an attack on individuals, it is an attack on democracy itself. Chapter 26: The rise of propaganda machines. Propaganda is the deliberate shaping of information to influence perception, beliefs, and behavior. While propaganda has existed throughout history, modern technology has amplified its reach, speed, and precision. Propaganda machines, coordinated networks of communication, media, and messaging, can create powerful, immersive narratives that shape entire societies. These systems work by controlling both content and context. Stories are crafted to evoke emotion, simplify complexity, and reinforce identity. Repetition normalizes messages. Selective amplification ensures that certain ideas dominate public discourse while alternative viewpoints are marginalized or discredited. The psychological impact is profound. Repeated exposure fosters familiarity and acceptance. People may begin to conflate repetition with truth, particularly when combined with authority signals, social reinforcement, or fear cues. Propaganda machines do not simply inform, they shape reality for their audience. They also increase polarization. By highlighting divisions, exaggerating threats, and framing opponents as enemies, propaganda machines intensify group identity. The sense of us versus them is strengthened, making compromise less likely and hostility more acceptable. The consequences for democracy are severe. When information is systematically controlled, scrutiny diminishes. Institutions lose oversight. Citizens are less able to evaluate claims critically. Decision-making becomes reactive, guided more by perception than by evidence. Propaganda machines do not require total control to be effective. Even partial dominance over information channels can shift perception, weaken trust, and limit alternatives. Over time, this cumulative effect reshapes public understanding, expectations, and norms. In essence, propaganda machines transform information from a tool of empowerment into a tool of control. Chapter 27, When Facts No Longer Matter. The collapse of truth is perhaps the most insidious threat to democracy. When facts no longer matter, the foundation of informed decision-making erodes. Citizens cannot evaluate policy, assess leadership, or understand consequences if the very notion of objective reality is questioned. This phenomenon does not appear suddenly. It is preceded by repeated disinformation, attacks on independent media, and the promotion of alternative truths. Over time, skepticism of evidence evolves into indifference. Facts are treated as optional, negotiable, or secondary to ideology. The consequences are wide-ranging. Policy debates lose substance. Laws are interpreted selectively. Institutions are undermined. Disagreements are no longer about outcomes or solutions, but about which version of reality is accepted. The social impact is equally profound. When shared facts collapse, trust between citizens declines. Conversations become symbolic rather than substantive. Group identity and loyalty increasingly determine belief rather than evidence or reasoned argument. Political leaders exploit this environment strategically. By framing reality as subjective, they insulate themselves from accountability. Criticism, data, and independent investigation lose power when outcomes can be dismissed as irrelevant or fabricated. Authority becomes less about competence and more about controlling perception. The long-term risk is systemic. Democracy relies on a shared understanding of reality. Without it, compromise becomes nearly impossible. Governance becomes reactive, conflict escalates, and institutions lose their capacity to enforce standards. Facts may survive in pockets, but their influence diminishes. Once citizens and leaders alike accept that facts are negotiable, the very fabric of democratic society begins to fray. Decisions are no longer guided by reality, they are guided by perception, ideology, or fear. When facts no longer matter, truth ceases to constrain power. And in that vacuum, democracy becomes vulnerable to manipulation, distortion, and ultimately collapse. Chapter 28. Controlling the Narrative. Control over the narrative is a central strategy in shaping public perception and maintaining power. In a democracy, narratives are naturally diverse. Different media outlets, political actors, and citizens present multiple perspectives on events, policies, and leadership. This plurality allows debate, scrutiny, and collective understanding. When a single actor or group begins to dominate the narrative, however, the balance shifts. Controlling the narrative involves directing attention, framing issues, and shaping interpretations. It is not merely about telling a story, it is about setting the terms of discourse. By determining what is highlighted, what is omitted, and how events are interpreted, leaders can guide public understanding to align with their objectives. The methods are both subtle and overt. Media access may be restricted to favorable outlets. Opposition voices are marginalized or discredited. Messaging is repeated consistently to reinforce a desired interpretation. Symbols, slogans, and emotionally charged language help embed the narrative into public consciousness. The impact on citizens is significant. When narratives are controlled, people receive information filtered through a specific lens. Their perception of reality becomes shaped less by independent observation and more by the curated version presented to them. Over time, this narrows the space for critical thinking and debate. Control over the narrative also reinforces power. Leaders who dominate how events are interpreted can shape expectations, define threats, and justify decisions. They influence not only what people think, but how they feel about what they think. Public consent becomes guided more by perception than by deliberation. In extreme cases, control over the narrative can marginalize independent institutions entirely. Courts, media, and oversight bodies may be framed as irrelevant, biased, or hostile, reducing their authority and effectiveness. When citizens rely primarily on curated narratives, institutional checks are weakened, making governance more dependent on centralized authority. Controlling the narrative is not simply a tactic, it is a structural shift. It reshapes how information flows, how reality is interpreted, and how citizens interact with power. By redefining what is visible, significant, or true, leaders can influence both perception and behavior on a massive scale. Chapter 29. Fear-based messaging. Fear is one of the most potent tools for influencing behavior. In democratic societies, citizens expect to make decisions based on reason, evidence, and discussion. Yet fear bypasses rational deliberation. It triggers instinctive responses, heightens emotional engagement, and focuses attention on immediate threats. Leaders who understand this dynamic can craft messages that exploit anxiety. Fear-based messaging emphasizes danger, uncertainty, or vulnerability. It highlights potential harm and presents the messenger as the protector or solution. By connecting fear with a narrative or policy, leaders can motivate action, loyalty, and compliance. The effectiveness of fear lies in its psychological impact. When people feel threatened, they prioritize safety over other considerations. Ethical norms, procedural fairness, and long-term consequences may become secondary to the need for security. This makes citizens more receptive to messages that promise protection, even at the cost of freedoms or democratic principles. Fear-based messaging often simplifies complex issues. Nuance is replaced by urgency, choice is framed as binary, and opponents are cast as sources of danger. This simplification makes it easier to mobilize public support and reduce dissent. Emotional resonance outweighs factual accuracy. Repeated exposure strengthens the effect. As fear-based messages circulate, they reinforce perception and shape behavior. Individuals become more likely to act in line with the narrative, and social networks amplify the emotional impact. The result is a feedback loop where fear generates compliance, which encourages further fear-based messaging. The consequences for democracy are serious. Policies that might otherwise be debated or scrutinized are accepted without question. Citizens may support measures that restrict rights or concentrate power, believing them necessary for protection. Institutions designed to safeguard accountability may be bypassed in the name of urgency. Fear is not inherently negative. It can signal genuine threats and prompt necessary action. The danger lies in its deliberate manipulation. When fear is manufactured or exaggerated, it becomes a tool for control rather than a response to reality. By using fear strategically, leaders can shape perception, behavior, and ultimately the trajectory of democratic governance. Chapter 30. Rewriting Reality. Rewriting reality is the ultimate extension of narrative control, disinformation, and propaganda. It is the process of reshaping how people perceive events, facts, and truths, not simply by presenting false information, but by constructing an alternative version of reality so comprehensive that it supersedes observation. This transformation is gradual. It begins with selective reporting, reinterpretation of events, or repetition of misleading narratives. Over time, the boundary between fact and fabrication becomes blurred, and perception aligns increasingly with the constructed narrative rather than with objective evidence. The mechanisms are sophisticated. Language is manipulated to reframe events. Symbols and imagery evoke emotional responses that support the narrative. Contradictory information is dismissed as irrelevant, biased, or malicious. Even historical records and scientific findings may be reinterpreted to reinforce the constructed reality. The effect is profound on public consciousness. People come to accept the rewritten narrative as legitimate, often without conscious awareness. Cognitive dissonance is minimized by social reinforcement and repeated exposure. Over time, what was once considered observable fact becomes malleable in the minds of the population. Rewriting reality serves multiple strategic purposes. It shields leaders from accountability, undermines opposition, and consolidates power. By defining reality, leaders define acceptable thought, acceptable action, and acceptable dissent. They control not only policy, but perception itself. The consequences for democratic systems are severe. Democracy depends on shared facts, mutual recognition, and informed decision-making. When reality is contested or reconstructed, the foundations of debate and compromise collapse. Citizens can no longer evaluate policies or leaders based on evidence. They are guided instead by perception, shaped through manipulation. The danger is cumulative. When citizens accept a rewritten reality, institutions, norms, and social structures gradually adapt to the new perception. Checks and balances may be ignored. Criticism is dismissed as irrelevant. The boundaries of acceptable behavior shift to accommodate the narrative. Rewriting reality is not merely a rhetorical strategy, it is a structural transformation. It redefines truth, reshapes perception, and alters the relationship between citizens and power. In a democracy, the ability to distinguish reality from fiction is fundamental. Once that ability is undermined, the system itself becomes vulnerable to manipulation, distortion, and ultimately collapse. Part 4. Breaking the System. Chapter 31. Undermining the Judiciary. The judiciary is a cornerstone of democratic governance. Courts serve as impartial arbiters, ensuring that laws are applied fairly, that rights are protected, and that abuses of power are checked. They provide a critical counterbalance to the executive and legislative branches, safeguarding the rule of law. When the judiciary is undermined, this balance begins to erode. Leaders may challenge court authority, question judicial decisions, or delegitimize rulings that do not align with political objectives. Public statements that attack judges personally or professionally can weaken trust in the system, portraying the judiciary as biased, ineffective, or hostile. The effects are far-reaching. When the court's legitimacy is questioned, citizens may lose confidence in their ability to protect rights and enforce justice. Institutions designed to act independently are perceived as partisan, reducing the willingness of the public to rely on their decisions. Undermining the judiciary also creates strategic advantages for leaders. By weakening courts, executives and legislatures can act with fewer constraints. Decisions that might have been checked or overturned gain latitude. Policy and governance increasingly reflect the preferences of those in power rather than the rule of law. Over time, norms that protect judicial independence erode. Even without formal changes to structure or procedure, repeated attacks on judicial authority reshape expectations. Judges may hesitate to rule against the government, fearing personal or institutional repercussions. Legal safeguards are weakened, and the judiciary's role as a check on power diminishes. Democracy depends on independent courts. Without a strong judiciary, the balance between branches collapses. Authority becomes concentrated, accountability declines, and citizens lose one of the most reliable mechanisms for protecting their rights. Chapter 32. Politicizing the Courts. The politicization of courts occurs when judicial decisions are influenced by political considerations rather than legal principles. In a democracy, courts are expected to be neutral, interpreting laws and upholding constitutional limits without favor. When judges are selected, pressured, or rewarded based on political loyalty, neutrality is compromised. Politicized courts serve the interests of the powerful rather than the principles of justice. Appointments, promotions, and removals may be based on alignment with the ruling party or leader rather than merit or experience. Decisions may increasingly reflect partisan goals, undermining confidence in impartiality. The public perception of the courts changes. Once citizens see the judiciary as politically aligned, trust erodes. Rulings are viewed through a lens of suspicion, and legitimacy becomes tied to partisanship rather than law. Ordinary citizens may feel that the legal system cannot protect them, reducing engagement and compliance. The long-term consequences are severe. When courts lose independence, other democratic safeguards are affected. Laws may be interpreted selectively. Oversight mechanisms may fail. Disputes are resolved according to political influence rather than established rules. Politicization also deepens polarization. Each side begins to view judicial decisions as a weapon rather than an impartial ruling. Legal outcomes are debated not on substance, but on perceived loyalty or bias, further dividing society. A politicized judiciary undermines the rule of law. When courts are perceived as tools of power rather than guardians of justice, democratic institutions weaken. Citizens are left with fewer mechanisms to hold leaders accountable, and the system's overall resilience declines. Chapter 33. Ignoring Constitutional Limits. Constitutions exist to define the boundaries of power. They ensure that authority is exercised within agreed limits, protecting citizens from arbitrary action and maintaining checks between branches of government. Ignoring these limits represents a direct threat to the stability and integrity of democratic governance. This process often begins gradually. Leaders may stretch powers under the guise of emergency measures, reinterpret laws to suit their objectives, or bypass procedures considered inconvenient. Initially, these actions may be presented as pragmatic solutions, but over time they erode established norms. Ignoring constitutional limits consolidates authority. As rules are bypassed, leaders gain flexibility to act without constraint. Institutions designed to prevent overreach are circumvented. Precedents are weakened, and the system becomes more dependent on the discretion and intentions of those in power. The consequences are structural. Citizens may accept violations if framed as necessary for security, efficiency, or progress. Over time, tolerance for bending or breaking rules becomes normalized, and limits that were once considered inviolable lose force. The system's checks begin to fail. Without adherence to constitutional boundaries, mechanisms designed to constrain power lose effectiveness. Laws intended to regulate government action can be ignored, and safeguards for rights and accountability are weakened. Democracy relies on adherence to rules as much as on elections. Ignoring constitutional limits transforms governance from a system of shared authority into one defined by personal discretion. The stability, predictability, and fairness essential to democratic life are undermined, leaving society more vulnerable to abuse of power. Chapter 34: Weakening Checks and Balances. Checks and balances are essential for preventing the concentration of power. Legislatures, executives, courts, and other institutions are designed to monitor, constrain, and complement one another. When functioning correctly, they prevent abuse, ensure accountability, and maintain democratic equilibrium. Weakening these mechanisms is a hallmark of democratic erosion. Leaders may centralize decision-making, bypass oversight committees, or reduce the authority of watchdog institutions. This allows them to act with greater autonomy, often without scrutiny. The effects are cumulative. As checks are weakened, one branch or actor gains disproportionate influence. Policy decisions may reflect individual preference rather than collective deliberation. Oversight diminishes, and institutional safeguards are rendered less effective. The public's trust is also affected. When oversight fails or is visibly ignored, citizens may perceive institutions as ineffective. Confidence in governance declines, and compliance with laws and regulations may weaken. Weakening checks and balances accelerates democratic decay. It removes constraints on power, reduces accountability, and allows leaders to consolidate authority incrementally. Over time, the system shifts from shared governance to centralized control, increasing vulnerability to authoritarian practices. A democracy without functioning checks and balances is not truly democratic. Its resilience is compromised, its institutions are hollowed out, its citizens are left without reliable mechanisms to ensure fairness, justice, or accountability. Chapter 35: Controlling Elections. Subtly, elections are the lifeblood of democracy. They provide a mechanism for accountability, representation, and change. Yet, even in free societies, the integrity of elections can be influenced subtly, without overt violations. Controlling elections subtly often begins with shaping perceptions. Media coverage, political messaging, and framing of candidates can influence which issues are emphasized and which candidates appear viable. Public attention is directed strategically, guiding the electorate's focus in ways that favor certain outcomes. The design of campaigns and messaging matters as much as the actual vote. Leaders may highlight threats, inflate achievements, or create doubt about opponents, steering voter behavior indirectly. The electorate may believe they are choosing freely, unaware of how perception has been manipulated to narrow the range of perceived options. Even subtle influence can have significant consequences. When citizens' understanding of candidates, policies, or issues is guided by selective messaging, elections reflect more the narrative constructed than the electorate's fully informed choice. The democratic ideal of equal, independent decision-making is compromised. Subtle control reinforces power incrementally. Unlike overt fraud, these tactics are difficult to identify and challenge. They exploit existing vulnerabilities in information systems, social dynamics, and human psychology, creating conditions favorable to those already in power. The danger lies in its invisibility. When manipulation is not overt, citizens may accept outcomes without question, believing the process to be fair. Yet, the cumulative effect of subtle influence erodes confidence in the democratic system, even if its erosion is gradual. Chapter 36: Voter Suppression Tactics. Voter suppression is a direct threat to democratic participation. While elections may remain technically free, obstacles to voting can systematically disadvantage certain groups, altering outcomes without overt fraud. Suppression tactics target accessibility, knowledge, and confidence in the voting process. Common methods include restrictive ID laws, complicated registration procedures, and limited polling locations. Each of these measures reduces participation among specific demographics, often those less politically aligned with those in power. The effect is cumulative. A small decrease in turnout across multiple groups can decisively influence results. Disinformation can also act as suppression. Misinformation about voting procedures, deadlines, or eligibility can intimidate or confuse voters. Even when the information is corrected later, the initial impact can discourage participation and reduce trust in the electoral process. Voter suppression undermines equality. Democracy relies on the principle that each citizen's vote carries equal weight. When certain groups are systematically impeded, the representativeness of elected officials declines, weakening legitimacy and eroding trust. The long-term consequences are serious. Suppression creates cynicism, disengagement, and the perception that the system is rigged. Participation declines over time, and the foundational principle of inclusive representation is eroded. Chapter 37: Changing Rules to Stay in Power. Manipulating the rules of governance is a hallmark of leaders seeking to extend their tenure. Legal frameworks, electoral processes, and institutional regulations can all be adjusted to favor incumbency. These changes may be subtle, framed as reforms or improvements, but their effect is to concentrate power. Rule changes can take many forms. Electoral boundaries may be redrawn to favor certain outcomes. Term limits may be adjusted or circumvented. Voting procedures can be modified in ways that benefit incumbents. Even procedural norms within legislatures can be altered to limit opposition influence. These adjustments are often justified as efficiency or modernization. By presenting changes as administrative improvements or responses to external challenges, leaders reduce public scrutiny and opposition. The electorate may perceive the changes as neutral or beneficial, unaware of their strategic purpose. The impact on democracy is cumulative. As rules shift in favor of those in power, accountability diminishes. Elections may continue, but they become less competitive. Institutions lose independence, and citizens' ability to influence outcomes through normal processes is weakened. Democratic resilience depends on fair rules and consistent application. When rules are altered to maintain power, even gradually, the balance of authority tilts. The system becomes more vulnerable to abuse, and the principle of government by consent is compromised. Chapter 38: When opposition is crushed, a healthy democracy depends on the presence of political opposition. Opposition parties, independent candidates, and dissenting voices provide checks on power, offer alternatives, and allow citizens to choose among competing ideas. They ensure that governance remains accountable and responsive. Crushing opposition transforms this dynamic. Opponents may face harassment, intimidation, or legal obstacles that make participation difficult. Media coverage may be restricted or biased, framing dissenters as illegitimate or dangerous. Over time, competition diminishes, leaving power concentrated in a single party or leader. The effects are both structural and psychological. Structurally, the absence of credible opposition reduces debate, scrutiny, and oversight. Decisions may reflect the interests of those in power rather than the collective good. Psychologically, citizens may perceive dissent as futile, fostering disengagement or resignation. Crushing opposition also reinforces control. Without challengers, leaders face fewer constraints. Policies can be implemented without negotiation. Criticism is minimized, and loyalty becomes the primary metric of political success. The erosion of competitive politics consolidates authority and weakens democratic resilience. Over time, this creates a cycle of dependency. As opposition diminishes, power becomes increasingly centralized, dissent becomes riskier, and citizens' ability to hold leaders accountable declines. Democracy loses one of its most critical self-correcting mechanisms. Chapter 39. Legal corruption. Corruption in a democratic system undermines trust, fairness, and accountability. When laws are applied selectively, institutions are influenced by personal or political interests, or officials exploit legal systems for gain, the rule of law is compromised. Legal corruption may be subtle or overt, but its impact on governance is profound. Subtle corruption often appears as favoritism or loophole exploitation. Contracts, regulations, and legal interpretations may be manipulated to benefit allies or supporters. Judicial decisions can reflect influence rather than impartiality. Bureaucratic procedures may be used to reward loyalty and punish dissent. Over time, these practices erode public confidence. Citizens begin to perceive the system as inherently biased. Compliance declines, engagement weakens. When the law is seen as a tool for advantage rather than justice, democratic legitimacy suffers. Legal corruption also reinforces inequality. Those with connections or resources gain advantage, while ordinary citizens are left with diminished recourse. Rights, protections, and remedies become unevenly distributed, weakening the social contract that underpins democracy. Unchecked legal corruption becomes systemic. It undermines institutions designed to constrain power, reduces accountability, and shifts governance from rule-based administration to personal discretion. Democracy survives in form, but its function is hollowed out. Chapter 40. When justice becomes a tool. Justice is meant to be impartial, consistent, and protective of rights. When it becomes a tool for those in power, however, it loses its independence and its purpose. Instead of safeguarding citizens and institutions, the legal system becomes an instrument for advancing political objectives. This transformation can take many forms. Courts may be used to silence opponents, legitimize controversial actions, or intimidate critics. Laws may be applied unevenly, targeting some while protecting others. Investigations can be delayed, obstructed, or manipulated to achieve strategic ends. The consequences are profound. When justice is wielded as a tool, citizens lose confidence in fairness. Individuals may fear legal consequences for expressing dissent or opposing authority. Political decision-making becomes insulated from scrutiny, and accountability diminishes. Instrumentalizing justice also alters societal norms. If legal outcomes are perceived as serving power rather than principle, citizens may begin to ignore laws, rationalize unethical behavior, or adopt similar strategies to achieve goals. The integrity of governance erodes. Ultimately, when justice becomes a tool, democracy is at risk. The separation of powers, the protection of rights, and the mechanisms of accountability all rely on impartial application of the law. Once justice is subordinated to political objectives, the system's ability to correct itself and maintain legitimacy is severely compromised. Part 5. The People Divided. Chapter 41. Polarization takes over. Polarization is both a symptom and a driver of democratic decay. In healthy democracies, citizens may disagree on policies, parties, or leaders, but shared norms and institutions provide a framework for compromise. Polarization occurs when these divisions deepen into entrenched hostility, where disagreement becomes identity and debate becomes conflict. Polarization often begins gradually. Political differences become framed not as alternative perspectives, but as moral imperatives. Opposing views are portrayed as dangerous, illegitimate, or threatening. Individuals start defining themselves by alignment with a group rather than by independent judgment. The effects are systemic. Institutions struggle to function impartially when partisanship dominates. Legislatures deadlock, compromise becomes rare, and decision-making slows. Citizens increasingly consume information selectively, reinforcing their beliefs and amplifying divisions. Polarization erodes trust. As groups retreat into ideological silos, mutual suspicion grows. Citizens begin to view opponents as enemies, not simply as competitors with different ideas. This perception undermines cooperation, negotiation, and the very sense of shared purpose that sustains democracy. The social consequences extend beyond politics. Polarization affects communities, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Civil debate is replaced by conflict, and public life becomes increasingly combative. In extreme cases, polarization can escalate to social unrest, weakening the stability of democratic institutions. Once polarization dominates, the capacity for dialogue diminishes. Democracy relies on the ability of citizens to engage constructively despite differences. When polarization takes over, compromise becomes almost impossible, and the system is vulnerable to exploitation by those who thrive in division. Chapter 42. Families, Friends, and Politics. Democracy is most vulnerable when its divisions seep into personal relationships. Politics, at its healthiest, is debated in forums, legislatures, and public discourse. When political conflict invades families, friendships, and everyday social interactions, the personal cost of disagreement rises. Emotional bonds can fracture over ideology, creating stress, alienation, and social isolation. These divisions are often reinforced by external messaging. Media, social networks, and political campaigns amplify conflict, framing issues as existential or zero-sum. Ordinary disagreements take on moral weight, and alignment with a political group becomes a marker of loyalty, even within personal relationships. The effects are both emotional and social. People may avoid discussion to prevent conflict, withdraw from social circles, or become distrustful of those with differing opinions. Civil relationships weaken, and social cohesion erodes. Political identity begins to override other social bonds. When politics permeates personal life, echo chambers deepen. Individuals increasingly seek social validation from like-minded peers, while dissenting voices are marginalized or excluded. This intensifies ideological reinforcement and reduces exposure to alternative perspectives, making reconciliation and understanding more difficult. The intrusion of politics into private life has long-term consequences. Social networks, familial, friendly, and communal, serve as informal spaces for reflection, empathy, and learning. When these spaces are dominated by political conflict, citizens lose opportunities for balanced dialogue, making democratic compromise less likely and societal trust more fragile. Chapter 43. The Collapse of Civil Discourse. Civil discourse is the foundation of democratic society. It allows disagreement without hostility, debate without vilification, and negotiation without coercion. When civil discourse collapses, communication becomes hostile, debate becomes personal, and compromise becomes nearly impossible. The collapse often starts subtly. Rhetoric becomes more aggressive. Opponents are demonized. Nuance and context are abandoned in favor of absolutism. Public conversation shifts from ideas to identity, from discussion to confrontation. The media and social networks accelerate this collapse. Platforms that reward outrage and engagement amplify extreme voices, while reasoned arguments are drowned out. Conversations in public forums and online often prioritize emotional impact over factual accuracy, reinforcing hostility and division. Civil discourse is further weakened when leaders model aggression. When political figures attack opponents personally, mock dissent, or label criticism as betrayal, they set a tone that legitimizes incivility. Citizens follow suit, mirroring the hostility and intolerance they observe. The consequences are profound. Without civil discourse, democratic institutions struggle to mediate disagreements. Policy debates become symbolic battles rather than practical problem-solving exercises. Compromise is framed as weakness, and collaboration is increasingly rare. The loss of civil discourse also fuels polarization and social fragmentation. As communication breaks down, trust declines. Communities become isolated, conflict escalates, and the space for dialogue and reconciliation narrows. Ultimately, democracy relies not only on elections and laws, but on the ability of citizens to engage respectfully and thoughtfully. When civil discourse collapses, the very fabric that allows diverse voices to coexist is threatened, leaving the system vulnerable to division, manipulation, and authoritarian tendencies. Chapter 44. Radicalization of the Public. Radicalization is the process by which ordinary citizens adopt extreme views, often abandoning compromise, moderation, or shared norms. In a functioning democracy, disagreement is expected, but debate remains grounded in mutual recognition and respect. Radicalization occurs when citizens no longer see opponents as legitimate participants, but as enemies to be defeated at any cost. The process is gradual. It often begins with exposure to repeated messaging that emphasizes division, injustice, or threat. Over time, individuals internalize these narratives, redefining their understanding of politics and society. What was once considered fringe or extreme becomes normalized. People are more likely to adopt extreme views when they perceive them as integral to belonging within a group. Political affiliation, social networks, and cultural communities reinforce alignment with the narrative, creating pressure to conform and discouraging dissent. The effects extend beyond belief. Radicalized citizens are more likely to engage in aggressive political behavior, dismiss opposing perspectives, and support authoritarian measures if framed as protecting their group or ideology. Tolerance for compromise declines, and the democratic fabric begins to fray. Unchecked radicalization has systemic consequences. When large segments of the population adopt extreme positions, institutions designed for negotiation and moderation struggle to function. Political discourse becomes dominated by conflict rather than collaboration, and social cohesion weakens. Radicalization is not inevitable, but once it takes root, it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Anger and fear intensify, narratives of division gain traction, and moderation becomes increasingly marginalized. Democracy, which relies on shared norms and trust, is left vulnerable. Chapter 45. The role of anger. Anger is a powerful motivator in politics. Unlike reasoned debate, which relies on facts, evidence, and deliberation, anger drives immediate responses, heightens emotional engagement, and simplifies complex issues into moral binaries. It is both a personal emotion and a social force, capable of shaping collective behavior. Political leaders often exploit anger strategically by emphasizing perceived injustices, threats, or betrayals. Leaders can channel public frustration toward desired targets. Opponents, institutions, and even neutral groups may be portrayed as sources of harm, fueling loyalty, obedience, or participation in extreme actions. Anger distorts perception. When citizens are angry, their ability to evaluate information objectively diminishes. Threats are magnified, nuances are ignored, and complex problems are reduced to simplistic narratives. Emotional resonance outweighs factual accuracy. Anger also reinforces group cohesion. Shared outrage unites supporters, creating solidarity against perceived enemies. It strengthens identity, increases commitment to the group, and discourages dissenting perspectives. The intensity of emotion makes moderation appear weak or disloyal. Unchecked anger accelerates democratic erosion. When policy and debate are driven by emotion rather than reason, institutions struggle to function. Decisions may prioritize immediate gratification or punishment over fairness, long-term planning, or stability. Citizens become reactive rather than deliberative, and polarization deepens. Understanding the role of anger is crucial. While emotion is a natural part of political life, its exploitation can destabilize societies, distort democratic processes, and pave the way for leaders who thrive on conflict rather than consensus. Chapter 46: Echo Chambers and Isolation. Echo chambers are environments in which individuals are exposed primarily to information that reinforces existing beliefs. In both digital and social spaces, echo chambers filter information, reduce exposure to alternative perspectives, and amplify confirmation bias. Isolation intensifies the effect, separating groups from one another and limiting opportunities for dialogue. The mechanics of echo chambers are subtle. Algorithms, media selection, and social networks all contribute. Content that aligns with prior beliefs is prioritized, while contradictory perspectives are marginalized or dismissed. Over time, individuals perceive their own worldview as normal, accurate, and under attack by outsiders. Isolation compounds the problem. When people interact primarily with like-minded peers, dissenting opinions are absent or viewed with suspicion. Social pressure reinforces conformity, discouraging critical evaluation and encouraging loyalty to the group's narrative. Echo chambers and isolation accelerate polarization. They foster extremism, intensify distrust of institutions, and create fertile ground for radicalization. Individuals may interpret neutral events as hostile, exaggerate threats, and adopt zero-sum thinking in politics. The consequences for democracy are significant. Shared understanding of facts, norms, and rules is essential for deliberation and compromise. Echo chambers fracture this foundation, making consensus more difficult, discourse more combative, and institutions more fragile. Breaking isolation requires deliberate effort. Exposure to diverse viewpoints, independent media, and constructive dialogue can counteract the reinforcing cycles of echo chambers. Without intervention, however, isolation becomes self-reinforcing, eroding the collective capacity for reasoned democratic engagement. Chapter 47: Distrust in Institutions. Institutions are the backbone of democracy. Courts, legislatures, electoral commissions, and law enforcement provide stability, enforce rules, and mediate disputes. They exist to ensure fairness and accountability. When citizens begin to distrust these institutions, the very structure of governance is threatened. Distrust often emerges gradually. It may begin with scandals, errors, or perceived bias, but is amplified by deliberate messaging that frames institutions as corrupt, inefficient, or hostile. Over time, ordinary mistakes are interpreted as evidence of systemic failure. The effects are widespread. Citizens may ignore legal directives, question official statistics, or reject election results. Compliance with laws and regulations declines. The social contract, based on the expectation that institutions serve the public fairly, erodes. Distrust also weakens oversight. Institutions rely on citizen engagement to maintain legitimacy. When people no longer trust them, oversight diminishes. Corruption, abuse, and inefficiency can persist unchecked. Leaders who manipulate public perception gain greater latitude to act without accountability. The erosion of trust has long-term consequences. Even if institutions are later reformed, the perception of failure can linger, making recovery slow and difficult. Democracy relies as much on legitimacy in the eyes of citizens as on formal structures. Once trust is gone, the system's resilience is compromised. Chapter 48. When violence becomes acceptable. Violence is the ultimate breakdown of democratic norms. In a healthy democracy, political disagreement is managed through debate, elections, and legal mechanisms. When violence becomes acceptable or even encouraged, citizens lose faith in these processes and conflict escalates. The normalization of violence is gradual. It begins with rhetoric that frames opponents as threats or enemies, justifying extreme measures. Minor acts of intimidation or harassment may appear trivial at first, but gradually create a culture in which aggression is tolerated or glorified. Violence undermines institutions. Courts, police, and legislatures are less effective when enforcement is challenged or resisted. Citizens may feel unsafe participating in politics, weakening engagement and allowing power to concentrate in the hands of those who control force. Violence also polarizes society further. Once conflict escalates beyond words, compromise becomes more difficult. Fear drives behavior, alliances harden, and dialogue collapses. Social cohesion weakens, creating fertile ground for further unrest. Unchecked, this dynamic can lead to a cycle of retaliation. Each act of violence justifies the next, and the moral boundaries of acceptable behavior erode. Democracy, which depends on orderly resolution of disputes, becomes increasingly unstable. Chapter 49. Street Conflicts and Protests. Protests are a normal and healthy part of democratic life. They allow citizens to express grievances, influence policy, and hold leaders accountable. However, when protests escalate into widespread street conflicts, the line between activism and destabilization blurs. Street conflicts often emerge from frustration and distrust. When citizens perceive institutions as unresponsive or corrupt, grievances accumulate. Demonstrations, which might begin peacefully, can turn confrontational when authorities respond with force, or when extremist elements exploit the situation. The escalation signals a breakdown in communication. Street conflicts reflect a failure of formal channels to address concerns. Dialogue between leaders, institutions, and citizens weakens. Violence becomes a tool for attention, negotiation, or coercion. Protests can also be manipulated. Political actors may exploit demonstrations to amplify narratives of crisis, threat, or disorder. Both state and non-state actors may encourage confrontations to mobilize supporters, discredit opponents, or justify emergency measures. The consequences are far-reaching. When street conflicts dominate the political landscape, governance is disrupted. Social trust erodes, public spaces become contested, and the capacity for cooperative problem-solving declines. Citizens may begin to see each other as threats, deepening social fragmentation. Chapter 50. Society turns against itself. Democracy depends on cohesion as much as freedom. When society begins to turn against itself, trust between citizens, communities, and institutions collapses. Polarization, fear, and manipulation fracture social bonds, creating an environment where collective action and cooperation are undermined. This phenomenon emerges from multiple sources: political rhetoric that demonizes opponents, media that amplifies division, and policies that favor some groups over others all contribute. Over time, citizens internalize narratives of threat, betrayal, and competition. The effects are systemic. Families, neighborhoods, and workplaces experience tension as disagreements escalate beyond discussion into conflict. Social networks fracture, and collective norms are replaced by suspicion and hostility. Collaboration across differences becomes rare. Society turning against itself undermines democracy. Shared values, trust in institutions, and respect for rules are all weakened. Decision-making becomes reactive and emotionally driven. Citizens prioritize self-preservation or group loyalty over the common good. The process is self-reinforcing. As trust declines and conflict spreads, more extreme measures are justified. Violence, coercion, and exclusion appear acceptable. Social cohesion erodes further, leaving democracy fragile and vulnerable to authoritarian control. The ultimate danger is structural. When citizens see one another as enemies rather than partners in governance, the foundation of democratic life, the ability to coexist despite differences, is destroyed. Recovery requires more than reforms. It requires rebuilding the social fabric itself. Part 6: Crisis and Opportunity. Chapter 51. Economic Collapse as a Trigger. Economic stability is a cornerstone of democratic resilience. When economies falter, through recession, hyperinflation, mass unemployment, or systemic failure, citizens' trust in government and institutions is tested. Financial insecurity amplifies fear, frustration, and dissatisfaction, creating fertile ground for political manipulation. Economic collapse functions as both a symptom and a trigger. A failing economy often reflects systemic weaknesses, mismanagement, or corruption, but it also acts as a catalyst, making citizens more receptive to radical solutions, promises of rapid recovery, or leaders who claim to have simple answers to complex problems. The psychological impact is profound. Financial insecurity heightens anxiety, reduces tolerance for nuance, and encourages reliance on authority figures who claim to provide certainty. Citizens may prioritize immediate relief or stability over long-term democratic principles. Economic collapse destabilizes institutions. Financial crises strain government capacity to deliver services, enforce laws, or maintain legitimacy. Bureaucracies slow, oversight weakens, and leaders may exploit emergency powers to consolidate control under the guise of addressing economic urgency. History shows the correlation clearly. Economic crises have frequently coincided with the rise of authoritarian leaders, mass radicalization, and the erosion of democratic norms. When survival becomes the priority, the appeal of certainty and strong leadership can outweigh commitment to democratic process. Understanding economic collapse as a trigger is crucial. It highlights the intersection of material insecurity, psychological stress, and political opportunism. Democracies may survive economic shocks, but without careful management, financial crises can accelerate their decay. Chapter 52. National Emergencies and Fear. National emergencies, whether natural disasters, pandemics, or internal crises, create conditions of heightened fear and uncertainty. In such contexts, citizens naturally seek protection, stability, and decisive action. While emergencies demand leadership, they also provide opportunities for power consolidation and the erosion of democratic safeguards. Leaders can exploit fear strategically, By emphasizing danger and urgency, they may justify extraordinary measures, reduce oversight, or circumvent normal decision-making processes. Citizens focused on survival often accept temporary restrictions or extraordinary powers. The danger is in the temporary becoming permanent. Emergency measures, once enacted, are rarely fully rolled back. Authorities may expand their scope, normalizing practices that would previously have been unacceptable. Institutions designed for checks and balances can be sidelined. Fear reshapes behavior and perception. Citizens may comply unquestioningly with policies, even if these limit freedoms or concentrate authority. Dissent is framed as irresponsible or dangerous. Public debate narrows, and the capacity for critical evaluation declines. National emergencies highlight a broader truth. Democracy depends not only on institutions, but on vigilance, awareness, and public willingness to question power. When fear dominates, those mechanisms weaken, leaving systems more susceptible to manipulation. Chapter 53: War and External Threats. External threats, including war, terrorism, or perceived national danger, have profound effects on democratic societies. Such crises heighten fear, trigger nationalism, and increase citizens' willingness to accept extraordinary measures. In the face of danger, people often prioritize security over liberty, stability over scrutiny, and conformity over debate. Leaders may exploit these dynamics by emphasizing threat, portraying enemies as existential dangers, and framing opposition as undermining national survival. Leaders can consolidate power and justify actions that would normally be considered overreach. War and threats reduce tolerance for dissent. During conflict, citizens may view criticism as betrayal. Legal safeguards, free speech, and independent oversight can be weakened in the name of unity or national interest. Emergency powers can become routine, and institutions adapt to serve expediency rather than principle. The psychological effect is cumulative. Fear of external threats makes citizens more likely to accept propaganda, disinformation, and authoritarian measures. Rational debate is overshadowed by urgency, loyalty, and the perceived need for decisive action. Historically, external threats have accelerated democratic erosion. Societies under siege often see polarization intensify, institutions weaken, and leaders centralize authority. While conflict is not inherently destructive to democracy, when fear and opportunism intersect, the risk of lasting damage rises sharply. Understanding the interplay of war, fear, and governance is essential. Democracies can survive external crises, but unchecked exploitation of threat can transform fear into a tool for power consolidation, further destabilizing the system. Chapter 54: Using Crisis to Gain Power. Crises, whether economic, social, or military, create unique opportunities for leaders to consolidate authority. In normal circumstances, power is balanced by institutions, oversight, and public accountability. In times of crisis, fear and uncertainty weaken these constraints, making citizens more willing to accept extraordinary measures. Leaders exploit this by presenting themselves as indispensable. They position themselves as the only solution to immediate threats, emphasizing decisiveness and capability. Citizens, anxious and vulnerable, often defer judgment, prioritizing survival over democratic process. Crisis also allows for the justification of controversial policies. Emergency measures, legal shortcuts, and unilateral decisions can be framed as necessary, temporary, and in the public interest. Yet, these actions frequently expand authority and shift long-term norms in favor of the incumbent. The psychological impact is profound. Crisis heightens emotional responses, reduces critical scrutiny, and make citizens more receptive to manipulation. Support for strong leadership grows, while tolerance for dissent and debate declines. The cumulative effect is a gradual power shift. Once authority has been expanded in the name of crisis, reversal becomes difficult. Temporary measures often become permanent, and leaders gain lasting advantages that reshape the political landscape. Chapter 55: Emergency Powers That Never End. Emergency powers are designed to be temporary tools to respond to exceptional circumstances. However, history shows that, once granted, these powers rarely return fully to normal oversight. Leaders often extend, reinterpret, or normalize emergency authority, gradually eroding checks and balances. These powers often begin under clear justification. Disasters, economic shocks, national threats, or pandemics can require rapid response. Citizens may willingly grant leaders extraordinary authority to ensure safety and stability. The danger lies in permanence. Once emergency powers are normalized, they provide legal and institutional cover for actions that would otherwise face opposition. Surveillance, censorship, expedited legislation, and control over resources can persist long after the original crisis. The effect on democracy is structural. Institutions that once provided independent oversight are weakened. Legal limits are circumvented. Citizens become conditioned to accept extraordinary measures as routine, reshaping expectations about governance and accountability. Emergency powers that never end erode the principle of consent. Democracy depends on the notion that citizens authorize and constrain government. When extraordinary powers become ordinary, authority shifts from shared oversight to centralized control. Chapter 56: The Suspension of Rights, Civil Liberties, Freedom of Speech, Assembly, Privacy, and Due Process are central to democracy. In times of crisis, these rights are often the first to be suspended, justified as necessary for security, stability, or efficiency. While intended as temporary, suspensions can become permanent instruments of control. Rights are suspended both overtly and subtly. Legal decrees, administrative orders, and executive actions may limit public protest, monitor communication, or restrict movement. Even subtle reductions in rights, curbing press access, restricting judicial review, can significantly alter democratic accountability. The consequences are profound. Once rights are curtailed, citizens lose tools to challenge authority. Opposition voices are marginalized, and power consolidates around decision-makers. Trust in institutions diminishes, and compliance is maintained through fear rather than consent. Suspension of rights creates a feedback loop. As authority expands, the mechanisms designed to protect citizens weaken. The more rights are limited, the easier it becomes to justify further restrictions. Norms of liberty erode, and citizens gradually accept a narrower definition of freedom. Democracy cannot survive long-term without rights. Even in emergencies, the preservation of basic liberties is essential for accountability, legitimacy, and resilience. Once suspension becomes the rule rather than the exception, the system shifts toward authoritarianism. Chapter 57: Security versus Freedom. The tension between security and freedom is a recurring dilemma in democratic societies. Citizens value both safety and liberty, yet emergencies, threats, or perceived dangers often force difficult trade-offs. Leaders exploit this tension to justify expanding control while curtailing civil rights. Security is framed as an immediate necessity. Fearful populations prioritize protection over deliberation. Measures that limit personal freedom, curfews, surveillance, censorship, or restricted mobility are often accepted as temporary safeguards. Freedom is portrayed as negotiable. Leaders may argue that certain liberties can be sacrificed in the name of survival, national stability, or public order. The compromise is rarely neutral. It usually favors the consolidation of power. The trade-off is rarely one-to-one. Loss of freedom does not guarantee safety. Security measures can be abused, misapplied, or politically manipulated. Over time, citizens may accept continued restriction, even in the absence of immediate danger. The balance between security and freedom defines democratic resilience. When fear consistently outweighs liberty, norms erode, and citizens become conditioned to accept authority without question. Democracy survives only when citizens remain vigilant, ensuring that security measures are both necessary and temporary. Chapter 58. The public accepts control. Democracy depends on active participation, scrutiny, and consent. Yet, when citizens become accustomed to centralized authority or perceive control as necessary for safety and stability, they may begin to accept restrictions on their own agency. This acceptance is rarely immediate. It is a gradual process shaped by fear, convenience, and social pressure. The mechanisms of acceptance are subtle. Propaganda, repetitive messaging, and framing dissent as dangerous can normalize control. Citizens internalize narratives that present centralized authority as benevolent, competent, and protective. Over time, compliance replaces critical evaluation. Social conformity reinforces the process. When the majority appears to support authority, individuals are less likely to resist. Peer pressure, fear of ostracism, and the desire for security encourage acquiescence. Collective behavior becomes self-reinforcing, further entrenching control. The consequences are profound. Once citizens accept control, even partially, the balance of power shifts dramatically. Leaders gain latitude to act without accountability, and institutions designed to mediate authority lose influence. Democracy becomes procedural rather than substantive. Elections may persist, but true choice diminishes. Public acceptance is the final safeguard that has shifted. Without resistance or oversight, authoritarian tendencies can solidify. Compliance becomes normalized and the system's resilience is compromised. In this context, control is no longer imposed. It is welcomed. Chapter 59. Leaders who refuse to step down. Leadership transitions are a cornerstone of democratic stability. Periodic elections, term limits, and voluntary resignation ensure that authority rotates and power remains accountable. When leaders refuse to step down, these norms are broken, and the democratic framework begins to erode. The refusal often begins legally, sometimes through manipulation. Leaders may reinterpret term limits, challenge electoral results, or amend constitutions to remain in office. Even when technically legitimate, such actions subvert the principle of rotation and weaken institutions designed to check power. The effects are both political and psychological. Politically concentrated authority reduces competition and undermines checks and balances. Psychologically, citizens may feel powerless, rationalizing inaction or acquiescing to avoid conflict. The perception that opposition is futile reinforces compliance. Refusing to step down creates a dangerous precedent. Once a leader circumvents established norms, others may follow, weakening the rule of law and institutional integrity. Authority becomes personal rather than procedural, and democratic principles are subordinated to individual ambition. The longer a leader maintains power, the harder it becomes to reverse. Institutions adapt to support incumbency, opposition is marginalized, and social acceptance of the leader solidifies. What begins as a personal strategy transforms into systemic risk for democracy itself. Chapter 60. The Point of No Return. Democratic erosion is often incremental, but there comes a stage where reversal becomes extremely difficult. This point of no return is reached when institutional safeguards, civil norms, and citizen engagement have been sufficiently weakened and centralized authority has become entrenched. Beyond this point, even elections, laws, and oversight mechanisms may exist only in form, not in function. Several factors contribute to this threshold. Public acceptance of control, normalized emergency powers, erosion of rights, politicized institutions, and suppression of opposition all combine to undermine resilience. Once citizens and institutions have adapted to authoritarian practices, restoration of full democracy becomes increasingly unlikely. The psychological dimension is crucial. Fear, social pressure, and habituation reduce resistance. Citizens may rationalize authoritarian actions as necessary or inevitable, while dissenters are silenced or marginalized. The moral and practical capacity for collective action diminishes. The consequences are structural. Power becomes concentrated. Independent institutions lose credibility, and civil liberties are permanently limited. Governance shifts from rule-based systems into discretionary authority, making future democratic revival extremely challenging. Recognizing the point of no return underscores the urgency of vigilance. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires active engagement, protection of norms, and enforcement of accountability. Once these fail, recovery becomes a monumental task, and the system is vulnerable to irreversible transformation. Part 7. The Final Stage. By this stage, the erosion of democratic institutions, norms, and citizen engagement has reached its zenith. Power is centralized, dissent is suppressed, and society has largely adapted to control. The mechanisms that once protected liberty, independent courts, free press, accountable legislatures, have been neutralized or co-opted. This final stage is defined not only by the presence of authoritarian structures, but also by the normalization of their existence. Citizens have become accustomed to fear, obedience, and the prioritization of loyalty over law and the system has shifted from democracy in form to authoritarianism in function. The following chapters explore the hallmarks of this final stage and the irreversible consequences of democratic collapse. Chapter 61. The New Authoritarian Normal. Once democratic erosion has progressed to the extreme, authoritarian practices are no longer temporary measures. They become normalized. Society adapts to control, and citizens no longer question restrictions on speech, assembly, or political participation. Emergency powers, previously justified as exceptional, are now standard tools of governance. Legal and institutional frameworks exist primarily to reinforce authority, not to constrain it. Normalization is reinforced by social and psychological mechanisms. Fear, habituation, and propaganda convince citizens that authoritarian measures are inevitable, necessary, or even beneficial. Loyalty and obedience become valued traits, while critical thinking and independent action are discouraged. Political institutions survive in form, but are hollowed out in function. Elections, courts, and legislatures may continue to exist, but they operate within boundaries defined by the authoritarian center. True accountability has disappeared, and checks and balances are symbolic rather than practical. The new normal is dangerous because it obscures the loss of democracy. Citizens may perceive society as stable and orderly, unaware that the freedoms and safeguards they once took for granted have been permanently compromised. The absence of overt crisis masks the underlying vulnerability of the system. Chapter 62. Institutional Collapse. Institutional collapse occurs when checks, balances, and governance mechanisms no longer operate effectively. Courts, legislatures, law enforcement, and independent agencies are either controlled by the ruling power or rendered ineffective through neglect, intimidation, or legal manipulation. The machinery of government continues to function, but it serves authority, not the public. The collapse is both structural and normative. Procedures may exist, but they are routinely circumvented. Laws may be ignored selectively. Civil servants may prioritize loyalty over competence. Citizens come to expect inefficiency, bias, and corruption as standard features of governance. Institutional collapse undermines accountability. Without functioning oversight, abuse of power goes unchecked. Policy is dictated by the preferences of a narrow elite rather than the collective interest. Citizens lose both voice and recourse. Recovery becomes nearly impossible. Once institutions are hollowed out and the culture of governance shifts toward obedience and loyalty, restoring independence, competence, and impartiality is extraordinarily difficult. The foundation of democracy has been replaced by the structures of authoritarian control. Chapter 63. Society adapts to control. By the final stage of collapse, society itself has adapted to authoritarian rule. Citizens modify their behavior to navigate restrictions, avoid punishment, and align with dominant narratives. Conformity, self-censorship, and loyalty are rewarded, while dissent, critical inquiry, and independent thought are marginalized or punished. This adaptation is both practical and psychological. Individuals learn to anticipate the boundaries of acceptable action. Communities develop informal norms to survive, often prioritizing compliance over principle. Fear and habit reinforce obedience, making the status quo appear natural. The social fabric transforms. Networks of trust and civic engagement shrink. Collective action becomes limited to sanctioned avenues. Shared norms are replaced by survival strategies, and political passivity becomes a dominant mode of interaction. Society's adaptation ensures the durability of authoritarian control. When citizens internalize the rules of compliance, the system gains resilience. Resistance is marginalized, and authoritarianism becomes self-reinforcing. Even in the absence of overt coercion, the democratic system cannot easily reassert itself. Chapter 64. Elections without meaning. In the final stage of democratic collapse, elections continue, but their significance is hollow. Procedures, ballots, and campaigns may remain, giving the appearance of legitimacy. However, real choice is severely constrained. Opposition is weakened, media is controlled, and outcomes are often predetermined. Citizens participate out of habit, expectation, or coercion, rather than meaningful influence. The illusion of democracy masks authoritarian control. Leaders may maintain elections to signal legitimacy to both domestic and international audiences. Yet, these elections function primarily as instruments of consolidation, reinforcing existing power rather than reflecting the will of the people. Voter engagement declines in quality, if not in quantity. Participation may remain high due to propaganda, social pressure, or compulsory voting, but genuine debate, policy alternatives, and independent oversight are absent. The electoral process becomes a ritual rather than a mechanism for accountability. Elections without meaning erode trust in governance. Even when citizens comply, they recognize the futility of participation. Cynicism and political apathy become entrenched, further cementing authoritarian control and reducing the potential for future democratic revival. Chapter 65. One-party dominance. Once a single party dominates the political landscape, the competition that sustains democracy disappears. Opposition parties, civil society actors, and independent institutions are marginalized, leaving the ruling party unchallenged. Policy, lawmaking, and governance reflect the priorities of the party rather than the electorate as a whole. One-party dominance undermines checks and balances. Legislatures, courts, and bureaucracies may be staffed by loyalists, ensuring compliance with party directives. Oversight is minimized, dissent is curtailed, and institutions intended to enforce accountability become instruments of control. The effects are cultural as well as political. Citizens internalize the permanence of party dominance. Loyalty to the ruling party becomes a social expectation, while opposition is viewed with suspicion, fear, or moral judgment. Political diversity and debate diminish. Over time, one-party dominance becomes self-reinforcing. Without credible opposition, the ruling party can entrench its position through legal manipulation, propaganda, and control of resources, creating a political monopoly that is difficult to challenge. Chapter 66: Silencing all opposition. In the final stage, opposition voices, political, social, or intellectual, are eliminated or neutralized. This is achieved through legal measures, intimidation, co-optation, and media control. Critics, dissenters, and activists are marginalized, arrested, or discredited, leaving the ruling authority unchecked and unchallenged. Silencing opposition consolidates power. With no competing voices to question decisions, policies are implemented unopposed. Laws and institutions operate primarily to maintain control rather than to serve justice or protect citizens. The social impact is profound. Without alternative perspectives, public debate collapses. Citizens are denied access to information, diverse ideas, and critical analysis, making them more dependent on official narratives. Fear and habituation suppress attempts at dissent. Eliminating opposition signals the final transformation. Democracy survives only in form, while function and substance are entirely subordinated to authority. Once opposition is silenced, restoration of pluralism becomes exceedingly difficult. Chapter 67: The End of Free Speech. Free speech is the lifeblood of democracy. In the final stage, it is the first right to be fully extinguished. Expression that challenges authority, exposes corruption, or critiques policy is curtailed through legal restrictions, censorship, surveillance, and social pressure. The suppression of speech is both practical and symbolic. Practical mechanisms prevent criticism from spreading, while symbolic measures, public shaming, legal intimidation, and propaganda reinforce the perception that dissent is unacceptable. Without free speech, accountability disappears. Citizens cannot organize, debate, or inform themselves fully. Leaders operate without scrutiny, and society loses the primary mechanism for correction and reform. The cultural impact is equally severe. When individuals internalize limits on expression, self-censorship becomes the norm. Critical thinking declines, creativity is stifled, and the collective capacity for independent decision-making is eroded. The end of free speech marks the culmination of democratic decay. At this stage, authority is absolute, dissent is invisible or punished, and the public has largely adapted to control. Democracy no longer functions as a system of shared power. It exists only as a shadow of its former self. Chapter 68: Surveillance of citizens. Surveillance is a hallmark of authoritarian control. In the final stage of democratic collapse, governments monitor citizens not only to prevent dissent, but also to normalize obedience. Digital tracking, phone monitoring, facial recognition, and data collection allow leaders to anticipate behavior, suppress opposition, and maintain a climate of fear. Surveillance shapes behavior subtly yet powerfully. Knowing that actions, speech, or associations are being observed, individuals begin to self-censor. Fear of reprisal discourages participation in political activity, civil society, or even private debate. Over time, surveillance becomes an invisible constraint on freedom. The psychological impact is profound. Citizens internalize oversight as a constant presence, leading to compliance without coercion. Loyalty is prioritized, independent thought diminishes, and social trust erodes as people become wary of each other. Surveillance is also a tool of control. Authorities can selectively target individuals or groups, enforce conformity, and manipulate public perception of loyalty. Information collected can be used to discredit opponents, justify arrests, or suppress movements before they gain traction. Unchecked surveillance transforms society. When citizens are constantly monitored, the lines between public and private, free and controlled, blur. The culture of accountability and debate collapses, leaving compliance and fear as dominant social norms. Chapter 69: Arresting Critics. The criminalization of dissent is a critical step in the final stage of democratic collapse. Leaders use the legal system to intimidate, silence, and eliminate critics. Journalists, activists, opposition politicians, and even ordinary citizens are at risk when their speech or actions challenge authority. Arrests serve as both punishment and warning. Arresting critics consolidates authority. It removes visible opposition, discourages others from speaking out, and demonstrates that rules apply unequally. Citizens begin to internalize boundaries, modifying behavior to avoid reprisals. The practice undermines justice. Courts and law enforcement, which are meant to ensure fairness, become instruments of power. Legal processes are manipulated to target opponents, while loyalists are protected or rewarded. The integrity of the legal system is eroded. Social and psychological consequences are profound. Fear permeates society. Dissent becomes rare. Self-censorship becomes widespread, and loyalty to authority is rewarded. Individuals comply not out of conviction, but to survive. Arresting critics signals that democracy is no longer functioning. When challenging authority carries the risk of imprisonment, detention, or persecution, the system is no longer accountable to the people. Freedom of expression, oversight, and political plurality are effectively eliminated. Chapter 70: Controlling Education. Control of education is a long-term strategy in the final stage of authoritarian consolidation. Schools, universities, and educational content become tools for shaping ideology, reinforcing loyalty, and limiting independent thought. Citizens are taught not only facts, but interpretations that favor authority, framing history, society, and politics to align with the ruling narrative. Education shapes perception from an early age. By controlling curricula, textbooks, and teaching methods, leaders influence how generations understand civic responsibility, rights, and political norms. Critical thinking, debate, and dissent are discouraged, replaced with obedience and conformity. The societal impact is cumulative. Over time, generations internalize state-sanctioned narratives. Questioning authority, challenging policy, or exploring alternative perspectives becomes psychologically difficult and socially risky. The cycle of control becomes self-perpetuating. Controlling education reinforces all other measures. When citizens are conditioned to accept centralized power as natural, propaganda as truth, and loyalty as virtue, resistance is marginalized. Surveillance, arrests, and restrictions become less necessary as societal norms align with authoritarian expectations. Education, once a foundation of democracy, becomes a tool of subjugation. By shaping knowledge and values, leaders secure the future of their control, ensuring that the democratic principles of critical thought, debate, and civic engagement are effectively lost for generations. Chapter 71: Fear as a Daily Reality. By the final stage of democratic collapse, fear is no longer occasional. It becomes a constant companion in citizens' daily lives. Fear is cultivated and maintained by a combination of surveillance, arrests, propaganda, and social pressure. Individuals internalize the threat of punishment for dissent, learning to navigate everyday life in ways that minimize exposure to scrutiny or retaliation. Fear transforms behavior. Citizens self-censor, avoid political engagement, and limit interactions with those who might be perceived as subversive. Even private spaces, homes, workplaces, and social gatherings are influenced by the need to conform. Loyalty, obedience, and caution become survival strategies. Fear reshapes society. Trust erodes. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members may hesitate to speak openly. Social networks fracture under suspicion and vigilance. The collective capacity for resistance diminishes as fear becomes normalized. Ultimately, fear sustains authoritarian control. When citizens internalize risk, they regulate themselves. The system no longer relies solely on coercion. The population participates in its own containment, ensuring stability for those in power. Fear becomes both a tool and a condition of life under authoritarianism. Chapter 72, The Death of Democracy. The death of democracy is the inevitable outcome when institutions, norms, and citizen engagement are destroyed. At this stage, elections, courts, and legislatures may still exist in form, but their substance is hollow. Power is concentrated, opposition is silenced, civil liberties are curtailed, and public participation is largely ritualized. The mechanisms that once held leaders accountable have been neutralized. Democracy dies gradually, but its disappearance is unmistakable. Rules are bent, rights are suspended, and emergency measures become permanent. Propaganda dominates public discourse, dissent is criminalized, and the public becomes accustomed to control. Citizens no longer experience genuine influence or choice. The cultural and psychological collapse is equally significant. Civic responsibility, independent thought, and mutual trust have been replaced by obedience, fear, and conformity. The social contract, the agreement between citizens and the state that defines democracy, is broken. The death of democracy marks the final transition. Once citizens accept centralized authority, normalized surveillance, and restricted freedoms, the system has transformed. Democracy in function no longer exists. Only a shell of institutions remains, sustaining power for those in control. Chapter 73, Life under Authoritarian Rule. Life under authoritarian rule is defined by control, limitation, and adaptation. Daily life is structured around compliance, loyalty, and vigilance. Citizens navigate a landscape of surveillance, restricted expression, and legal unpredictability. What was once considered normal civic freedom is now contingent on adherence to authority. Education, media, and public discourse are instruments of control. Information is curated to reinforce loyalty and obedience. Propaganda shapes perception of history, society, and politics. Critical thought is discouraged, and conformity is rewarded socially and politically. Social and personal relationships are affected. Fear of surveillance and reprisals infiltrates private life. Individuals self-censor, alter behavior, and avoid risk. Trust is limited to small circles or completely eroded. Communities function less as spaces of collaboration and more as networks of compliance. The psychological impact is profound. Citizens experience constant tension between survival, loyalty, and private belief. Anxiety, suspicion, and adaptation dominate the human experience. The capacity for collective action, civic engagement, and democratic renewal is severely limited. Life under authoritarian rule is stable yet fragile. While the system maintains order and appearance of governance, The loss of freedom, oversight, and pluralism ensures that society is perpetually constrained, leaving democracy permanently altered or extinct. Part 8. Lessons from Collapse. Chapter 74. Historical Examples of Collapse. History offers numerous examples of democracies and republics succumbing to authoritarianism. From the fall of the Roman Republic to the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, patterns emerge in how power consolidates, institutions fail, and citizens acquiesce. Each case differs in context, but the underlying mechanisms are often strikingly similar. Economic instability, social unrest, and political polarization frequently precede collapse. In many cases, crises, whether financial, military, or social, create openings for strong leaders to claim extraordinary authority. Citizens, fearing disorder or seeking protection, tolerate measures that would previously have been unacceptable. Erosion of norms and institutions is another common factor. Courts, legislatures, and civil protections gradually lose independence or effectiveness. Opposition is marginalized, press freedoms curtailed, and civil liberties suspended. Citizens become accustomed to obedience and control. The lessons of history are clear. While circumstances vary, the combination of fear, manipulation, institutional weakness, and citizen acquiescence repeatedly enables the transition from democracy to authoritarian rule. Recognizing these patterns is crucial to preventing similar outcomes today. Chapter 75. Patterns that repeat. Despite differences in time and geography, certain patterns recur in democratic collapse. Early warning signs, erosion of trust, normalization of emergency powers, suppression of dissent, and propaganda often precede full authoritarian control. Leaders exploit fear, division, and polarization to consolidate power incrementally. The cycle is often gradual, not abrupt. Small steps, each justified in isolation, accumulate over years or decades. Citizens adapt to each change, rarely perceiving the broader trajectory until the point of no return has been reached. Social and psychological dynamics are central. Fear, loyalty, habituation, and identity reinforce authoritarian practices. Propaganda, echo chambers, and control of information shape perception, while normalization of restrictions reduces resistance. Citizens often participate in their own containment. Patterns that repeat across history offer warning. Recognizing the sequence of weakening institutions, silencing opposition, curbing freedoms, and consolidating power is essential. Awareness allows citizens and institutions to intervene before the cycle reaches its irreversible stage. Chapter 76. Could it happen anywhere? No democracy is immune. While political culture, economic stability, and institutional strength vary, the mechanisms that erode democracy are universal. Corruption, polarization, fear, and the concentration of power can occur in any society if safeguards are weakened or ignored. Vigilance is the first line of defense. Active civil society, independent media, engaged citizens, and strong institutions help prevent erosion. Awareness of early warning signs, manipulation of fear, normalization of emergency powers, and marginalization of dissent is critical. Even stable democracies are vulnerable. History shows that societies with long-standing institutions are not invulnerable. Complacency, overconfidence, or failure to address inequality, polarization, and institutional decay can create openings for authoritarian consolidation. Understanding the risk is essential. By studying history and recognizing recurring patterns, citizens and leaders can take proactive measures to protect freedom, maintain accountability, and preserve democratic norms before it is too late. Chapter 77. Warning Signs Today. The signs of democratic erosion are often subtle, but history shows they should never be ignored. Rising polarization, attacks on independent institutions, the spread of disinformation, and normalization of emergency powers all serve as red flags. Citizens may notice small erosions of trust, incremental suppression of rights, or the centralization of authority before the system reaches crisis. Awareness is essential. Recognizing early warning signs allows for intervention, debate, and corrective measures. Societies that ignore these signals risk gradual normalization of authoritarian practices, often until it is too late. Modern tools amplify both risk and awareness. Social media, surveillance technology, and global communication can accelerate manipulation, radicalization, and fear. Conversely, they also provide mechanisms for exposing abuses, organizing civic action, and educating the public. Democracy requires constant vigilance. By paying attention to the warning signs, citizens and institutions can act proactively, ensuring that temporary crises do not become permanent transformations of power. Chapter 78. Can Democracies Recover? The resilience of democracy depends on institutions, norms, and civic engagement. Recovery is possible if citizens demand accountability, independent institutions are strengthened, and legal protections are reinforced. However, the longer authoritarian practices persist, the harder it becomes to restore full democratic function. Restoration requires more than elections. It demands rebuilding public trust, reinstating civil liberties, rehabilitating independent institutions, and ensuring that the mechanisms of oversight and transparency are functional. Social cohesion and the willingness of citizens to engage critically are also essential. History shows recovery is difficult, but not impossible. Countries that have returned from authoritarian rule often faced years of legal, social, and cultural reconstruction. The key lies in addressing both structural failures and the psychological acceptance of control. Democratic recovery is a collective responsibility. It requires leaders, institutions, and citizens to collaborate, uphold principles of accountability, and resist complacency or fear-driven obedience. Chapter 79. The Role of Citizens. Citizens are the ultimate safeguard of democracy. Their vigilance, participation, and willingness to hold leaders accountable determine whether democratic norms endure or erode. Compliance without scrutiny, apathy, or passive acceptance of authoritarian practices accelerates collapse. Active citizenship includes multiple dimensions: awareness, recognizing threats to institutions and freedoms; engagement, voting, civic involvement, and advocacy; accountability, challenging abuses, demanding transparency, and upholding the rule of law; solidarity, supporting independent institutions, civil society, and marginalized voices. The actions of individuals collectively shape the trajectory of society. Even strong institutions can fail if citizens disengage. Conversely, an engaged populace can resist manipulation, restore norms, and rebuild democratic culture. Citizens are not just participants, they are defenders of the system itself. Chapter 80. Protecting Democratic Institutions. Institutions are the backbone of democracy, and their protection is essential for long-term stability. Courts, legislatures, free press, and independent agencies function as checks on power, ensuring accountability and fairness. Safeguarding these institutions requires legal frameworks, cultural respect, and active public oversight. Key strategies include reinforcing independence, ensuring that appointments, funding, and oversight are free from partisan manipulation; transparency and accountability. Public reporting, open hearings, and judicial review prevent abuses. Education and civic awareness. Citizens must understand the purpose and function of institutions to defend them effectively. Resilience to manipulation. Institutions must resist propaganda, populist pressures, and short-term political expediency. Protecting institutions is a collective effort. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It relies on both structural safeguards and the vigilance of citizens. When institutions are robust, independent, and respected, the system can withstand crises and resist authoritarian consolidation. The preservation of democracy is an ongoing responsibility. Through vigilance, engagement, and institutional protection, societies can ensure that freedom, rights, and pluralism are maintained for future generations. Chapter 81. The Power of Truth. Even in the darkest stages of democratic erosion, truth remains the foundation of resilience. Information, facts, and evidence provide citizens with the tools to recognize manipulation, challenge authoritarian narratives, and demand accountability. When truth is suppressed or distorted, society loses its ability to make informed decisions, leaving citizens vulnerable to control. Truth empowers citizens and institutions alike. Independent media, whistleblowers, academic research, and open discourse create checks against abuse. The dissemination of accurate information can expose corruption, debunk propaganda, and reveal the consequences of unchecked authority. The struggle for truth is ongoing. Authoritarian regimes often target the very channels that convey facts, replacing them with curated narratives. Citizens must be vigilant, questioning sources, cross-referencing information, and resisting attempts to normalize deception. Ultimately, truth is a safeguard. It is not merely a moral principle. It is a practical tool for preserving freedom, enabling accountability, and ensuring that democracy can survive crises and rebuild after erosion. Chapter 82. Rebuilding After Collapse. Recovery from democratic collapse is possible, but it requires deliberate action across political, institutional, and social levels. Rebuilding begins with restoring institutions. Courts, legislatures, law enforcement, and civil service must regain independence, integrity, and credibility. Legal frameworks must be enforced to prevent the re-emergence of authoritarian practices. Equally important is rebuilding culture. Citizens must relearn civic responsibility, critical thinking, and engagement. Social trust, collaboration, and pluralism, eroded during collapse, must be nurtured through education, public discourse, and participatory governance. Rebuilding is a long-term endeavor. Structural reforms, public accountability, and civic resilience must reinforce each other. Patience and vigilance are required as old habits of obedience, fear, and apathy may persist. The ultimate goal is sustainable democracy. Restoration is not simply about re-establishing institutions. It is about embedding principles of transparency, accountability, and citizen empowerment so that democratic collapse cannot recur. Chapter 83. A Final Warning. The story of democratic collapse is not merely historical. It is a cautionary tale for today. Democracies are fragile, and freedom is not self-sustaining. Complacency, fear, manipulation, and the gradual erosion of norms can pave the way for authoritarianism even in societies that seem secure. Citizens, institutions, and leaders share responsibility. Vigilance, engagement, and respect for democratic principles are essential. Allowing power to concentrate, ignoring warning signs, or tolerating the suppression of rights can set the stage for irreversible change. Democracy must be actively defended. Every generation inherits the work of protecting liberty, pluralism, and justice. Failure to do so invites the very collapse these chapters describe. Awareness, action, and courage are the tools that prevent history from repeating itself. This book is a call to recognize the fragility of freedom and to act decisively before the point of no return is reached. The cost of inaction is permanent, and the consequences are borne by all.